Sí, ya estamos. Puedes comenzar, Juan Pablo.
Ay, no sé qué hice. Ya, ok.
No te preocupes, Juan Pablo, ya puedes empezar. Estamos transmitiendo en vivo en Academic Online.
Good morning, afternoon, or evening. This is Juan Pablo Pérez León Acevedo. I am a researcher and lecturer at the University of Jyväskylä in Finland. And on behalf of the Faculty of Law of the Technological University of Peru and the Association Académica Online from Argentina, it's a great pleasure and honor to have this event concerning the invasion by Russia of Ukraine. The event will have the participation of speakers from different countries. We are particularly grateful to have Dr. Sergei Masol from Ukraine, despite the very difficult circumstances that his country is enduring right now. I am quite sure that we will learn tremendously from his knowledge and insights. There are 5 panelists, and we have divided these panelists presentations into 2 blocks. The first block will consist of 3 presentations by Sergei Masol, George Chakdatse, and myself. And then we'll continue with the presentations and comments by 2 distinguished scholars, Daniela Malapi and Carolina Loaiza Tamayo. Now I will say the same in Spanish. Buenos días con todos. Es un placer tenerlos en el evento que la Universidad Tecnológica del Perú, Facultad de Derecho, y la Asociación Académica Online Académica de Argentina organizan. La invasión rusa de Ucrania, perspectivas desde el derecho internacional y relaciones internacionales. Tenemos panelistas de diferentes países y agradecemos especialmente al doctor Sergei Masol, un académico distinguido de Ucrania, que a pesar de las muy difíciles circunstancias de su país, está con nosotros. Estoy seguro que vamos a beneficiarnos y vamos a aprender mucho de sus experiencias y conocimiento. Este evento tendrá 2 paneles o 2 bloques. El primero de ponencias en inglés, con la participación de Sergei Masol, George Chakdatse y quien habla. Y luego daremos la palabra a 2 distinguidas académicas de Perú, Daniela Malapi y Carolina Loaiza Tamayo. Ahora paso nuevamente en inglés. After the presentation rounds, we will open the floor for questions and answers. We would like to ask you, because it is a bilingual event, that please, when you formulate your question, indicate clearly who is the speaker that you are addressing your question, or if you would like to address the question to all panel members, please indicate so explicitly. Final point concerns certification. There will be some link to a certification form in the transition from the English to the Spanish block, and also at the end of this event. Now I will say the same in Spanish. Al final de las presentaciones vamos a tener una ronda de preguntas. Les pediríamos que por favor cuando hagan sus preguntas indiquen claramente a quién están formulando, o si está formulada todo el panel, que lo mencionen de esa forma. También en el interín entre el bloque en inglés al bloque en español habrá un link para los formularios de certificación y también al final del evento. And now back to English. De vuelta a español, en inglés. Without further ado, I will give the floor to Dr. Sergei Massol. Dr. Sergei Massol is a researcher at the University of Cologne in Germany. He holds a doctoral degree from the European University Institute in Florence, Italy, a master's degree in international human rights law by Lund University in Sweden, and a bachelor in international relations by the National Aviation University in Ukraine. Dr. Massol will present for about 30 minutes. So please, Dr. Massol, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan Pablo. I will try to share my presentation now. How to do that? Do you see my PowerPoint presentation? Yeah, great. So thank you for the introduction, Juan Pablo. I would like to talk today about the briefly about historical cultural context of the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, and then outline a number of challenges to international law posed by this armed conflict. For most of you, today's topic is a matter of international law and geopolitics, international relations. For me as well, in addition to that, it's also a matter of survival, both personal and national. And I will touch upon that issue and how it's intertwined with international legal arguments in my today's presentation. At the very beginning, I would like to present in a nutshell what Ukraine is, where it is, because basically it is a misconception to believe that everybody around the world knows about every other country. So I would try to look in the mirror yesterday. What do I know about Peru? Do I know much? And in fact, I know very little. So I will outline a number of important facts which would help you to understand the armed conflict and international legal implications thereof. So Ukraine is the biggest country which is fully located within Europe. One can claim that the biggest is Russia. It is not fully in Europe, but if you disregard that, then Russia is the biggest. Ukraine is second biggest in Europe. The population of Ukraine is 43 million inhabitants. If you count Crimea, sometimes the statistics does not count Crimea, then it's 41 million inhabitants. An important demographic factor is the number of ethnic Ukrainians and representatives of other ethnic groups and which languages they speak, because it has been one of the crucial factors leading to this armed conflict. The latest census carried out in Ukraine was in 2001, that is 21 years ago. Of course, it's a bit outdated. It does not follow, Ukraine hasn't followed the recommendations that census have to be conducted every 10 years. So unfortunately, it's 20 years old, but still, that's the only one we have. And according to this census, 78% of the population consider themselves as ethnic Ukrainians, and 17% are ethnic Russians. At the same time, and that's one of the major distinctions which some foreigners fail to identify, is that Ukrainian and Russian ethnicity is not tantamount to Ukrainian-speaking and Russian-speaking population of Ukraine. So according to the census, 68% of Ukrainian citizens claim that their mother tongue is Ukrainian, and 30% claim that it is Russian. So you can see the discrepancy between Russian ethnic group within Ukraine and Russian speaking population of Ukraine. The Russian speaking population is higher than the actual ethnicity. There are a number of factors, a number of reasons for that. One can recall the most recent one is the Soviet Union's policy of Russification of Ukrainian, of Soviet citizens. Ukraine belonged to the Soviet Union in the 20th century. So people migrating from the village, from the countryside to bigger cities, they faced the problem that to advance their career, to be successful in their career, they had to master Russian. And as a result, sometimes by force, sometimes due to these structural reasons, more and more people began to use Russian in their daily life, and they taught Russian to their children. And so that's how the population, predominantly Ukrainian-speaking population of the rural areas, and Ukraine was a very rural country up to the 20th century, they became Russian speakers in a way. The same holds true for my family. My grandparents, when my grandparents were of the age I'm now, they did not speak Russian at all. And then they mastered it in their mid-30s, and eventually I grew up in a very mixed linguistic environment. Then another important historical factor in legal history of Ukraine that is relevant for the current discussion is a number of international instruments that Ukraine has adopted. And I would only outline some of them. The country gave up its nuclear weaponry in mid-1990s, which was the third largest stockpile in the world at the time. And it signed the so-called Budapest Memorandum on Security and Assurances in 1994, where a number of big powers, including the USA and Russia, guaranteed Ukrainian territorial integrity, provided that Ukraine gives up its nuclear arsenal. Ukraine did that, and the guarantees failed. In 2014, Ukraine's territorial integrity was not protected by the signatories of this memorandum. There are discussions within the epistemic community of lawyers whether this memorandum contains any legally binding obligations or not. I would not touch upon that issue, but it has been discussed a lot in academia. But the question remains the fact remains that there were at the very least political guarantees that Ukraine's territorial integrity would be protected. And what we have seen for already 8 years is that one of the signatories of that instrument breached the territorial integrity of Ukraine, that is Russia. At the same time, Russia breached two other international treaties, the 1997 Russian-Ukrainian Friendship Treaty and the 2003 Russian-Ukrainian State Border Treaty. In these two international instruments, both countries recognize the territorial integrity of each other and the inviolability of borders. To sum up, today Ukraine is a member of a number of international organizations. That is the United Nations. It is a founding member of the United Nations. The OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which has been actively involved with its special monitoring mission in Ukraine for the last 8 years. Unfortunately, this mission had to be terminated 2 weeks ago because it's not a war mission in a sense that it cannot be carried out when there are hostilities going on around. Ukraine is also a member of the Council of Europe, and that is the European Court of Human Rights included. It has a special relationship with the International Criminal Court. I believe Juan Pablo will touch upon that issue in his presentation dealing with international dispute settlement. Crucially, Ukraine is not member of NATO, not member of the EU, and not member of Eurasian Economic Union. So having presented these set of historical facts and demographic facts about Ukraine, I would now briefly introduce the armed conflict, how it happened, why it happened, what are the arguments of parties. So in my slide, which you can see on my PowerPoint slide, the first slide is it's called the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, challenges to international law. And I would like to underscore the word full-scale. I think it is one of the misleading beliefs by many lay people that Russia invaded Ukraine only on the 24th of February 2022. As a matter of fact, the armed conflict has been going on for already 8 years, since February 2014. It all started with the mass protests in Ukraine from December 2013 till February 2014, which Russia calls a coup d'etat. And those protests, known as the Euromaidan, were sparked by the government's decision not to sign an association agreement with the European Union. In addition, protesters were dissatisfied with pervasive corruption, police brutality, and so on. The death toll of those protests exceeded 100, including at least 13 police officers. And there were many instances of ill treatment, torture, abduction, and arbitrary deprivation of liberty. In March 2014, Russia occupied Crimea, which Russia calls reintegration of Crimea with the Russian Federation. And the legal basis for that was the referendum organized in Crimea in mid-March 2014, with very high numbers. The participants of that referendum voted to join Russia. Eventually, Crimea declared its independence, as well as Sevastopol, the city of Sevastopol, which had a special status according to Ukrainian law, also declared its independence. So technically, for a few hours, one can claim that they existed as sovereign states, and then they signed bilateral agreements with Russia to join Russia. So that was the legal argumentation of the Russian Federation, how Crimea became part of Russia. The right to self-determination of Crimean people, the so-called Crimean people, and then bilateral treaties with each of the two entities. Now we can jump to the facts, the situation in 2022. Russia essentially used the same legal tactics to recognize the independence of Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic. Both entities had referenda, although a few years ago, but Russia ignored those referenda for years. And all of a sudden, in 2022, it decided to recognize their independence. However, it did not incorporate these entities into Russian territory, but recognized their sovereignty, so they're as sovereign states. Here again, the right to self-determination was one of the crucial legal arguments, and I will touch upon that later when I will talk about challenges to international law. In April 2014, after Russia occupied Crimea, or reintegrated Crimea, if you use their legal vocabulary, the southeast of Ukraine became was in focus of world media, and there were hostilities going on, and the Ukrainian government, the Kyiv government, launched an anti-terrorist operation in the southeast of the country, trying to suppress the separatists. It was not successful, in part due to Russia's involvement, military involvement, in support of those separatists. That led to two international agreements concluded in Minsk. They are known as Minsk agreements in 2014, 2015, and they consisted of a package of measures, including a ceasefire, withdrawal of heavy weapons from the front line, release of prisoners of war, and the constitutional reform in Ukraine to grant more autonomy and more self-government rights to Donetsk and Luhansk provinces. It has not been implemented in fully, and that was one of the reasons, pretexts why Russia in 2022 began large military buildup along the border with Ukraine. And in February 2022, recognized the Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic as sovereign states. The next step by the Russian Federation was to sign bilateral agreements. However, in contrast to the agreements with the Crimean entities, these agreements concerned the use of military force, or as Russia claimed, the peacekeeping operation, helping to restore peace in the area. Having recognized these two entities, the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic, as sovereign states, Russia resorted to a conventional, a classical legal argument about the use of force, and that is the inherent right to collective self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter. So in the logic of the Kremlin, these are two sovereign states. They signed Russia recognized these entities as sovereign states, and they signed bilateral agreements with Russia, and now Russia can help them upon their request, and they requested that help to use Article 51 of the UN Charter against the Kiev government. So in February 2022, Russia Federation Council unanimously authorized use of military force, and Russian armed forces entered Ukraine officially. So for 8 years, Russia has been denying its military involvement in Donbass, in the east of Ukraine, and all of a sudden, in February 2022, it called the Minsk agreements obsolete and resorted to military force to solve the dispute. The invasion was both in the air, so there were missiles and airstrikes which struck places all around Ukraine, including the capital. And shortly, these were followed by large-scale ground invasion, prompting Ukraine to enact martial law and general mobilization. And now, on the in the picture which I share with you in my PowerPoint, you can see the directions from which Russia started its full-scale invasion of Ukraine 2 weeks ago. The red color indicates the territories under Russian military control, and as you can see, Russia attacked the country from the south, from the east, from the northeast, as well as from the north, from the territory of Belarus, so another sovereign state which provided its territory for the Russian armed forces. For the time being, it does not seem that the Belarusian armed forces have been involved in any hostilities. However, it is undeniable that the Belarusian territory has been used by Russian armed forces to attack Ukraine. So far, Russia has occupied only one capital of province, it's Kherson in the south of the country, and there are bloody battles going on right now in Kharkiv, Mariupol, Mykolaiv, and the capital city, Kyiv. As of the 8th of March, the latest data I could find, according to the United Nations, at least 516 civilians were killed. I mean, from 24th of February until the 8th of March, only during this short period of time. And more than 900 civilians were wounded. The UN admits that the real numbers are considerably higher because it's difficult to count civilian losses in the fog of war. For example, the Ukrainian authorities report that there are more than 1,300 civilians died only in the besieged town of Mariupol in the southeast of the country. And as of yesterday, it is reported that Russia inflicted gigantic damages on the Ukrainian infrastructure, which is estimated to be approximately 55 billion US dollars, and namely 200 schools, 30 health centers, 8 churches, more than 1,600 residential houses, 19 governmental offices, 23 factories, 12 airports, and 5 electric power plants. Talking about power plants, it is important to note that the Russian armed forces currently control their Chernobyl nuclear power plant, which is not functional anymore, but it still has their nuclear particles. I'm not a big expert in physics, but although the nuclear power station is not functional anymore, but it still needs to be monitored by personnel, and the nuclear stuff has to be secured. In addition, Russia occupied the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant station in the southeast of the country. It is the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe. And there is a danger reported by Ukrainian authorities that hostilities near nuclear power plants, because Zaporizhia nuclear power plant was in fact shelled several days ago. So the hostilities in the close vicinity of such dangerous objects can cause explosion, nuclear explosion, and nuclear pollution. And keeping in mind the size of the nuclear power plant, the biggest in Europe, as I said, the damages, the environmental damages, can be disastrous for the entire continent. Then, in addition to the potential environmental damage, and also factual environmental damage, because Russia has bombed a number of petrol storage facilities, and petrol was burning and polluting the air. There are also allegations of nuclear pollution in the Chernobyl area, because Russian heavy tanks are moving from the north to the south, and they raise nuclear dust from the ground, which had been lying there peacefully for 30 years. And now these heavy vehicles, they raise this nuclear dust up in the air and move it, because the vehicles move further down to the south, to Kiev, and they spread this nuclear dust around the country. So that is also a dangerous signal, which can lead to unpredictable environmental consequences. The West reacted quite promptly to this full-scale invasion, imposing draconian economic sanctions on Russia. I will not outline those. You probably have seen them in media. The West also supplies weaponry to Ukrainian government, and there have also been different sports and cultural cuts of Russia from the international community, particularly the Russian football team. The national football team or sports clubs cannot participate in any competitions of FIFA or UEFA, particularly the coming World Cup in Qatar, where Russia, to which Russia could have still qualified, but now it is eliminated from this competition. Despite this enormous economic sanctions, and also cultural and sports and other restrictions imposed on Russia, the international legal community has been less powerful in its condemnation of Russia, in a sense that the organ that is responsible for the maintenance of international peace and security, the United Nations Security Council, lacked unanimity among its 5 permanent members. Russia said yes, China abstained. Basically, the Security Council failed to act as required to maintain international peace and security, and the resolution on Ukraine was not adopted. Instead, an emergency special session of the UN General Assembly was convened, and that was the 11th special session of this kind since the founding of the United Nations. And the UN General Assembly adopted the so-called Uniting for Peace resolution. 141 states, including Peru, voted in favor, 35 states abstained, 5 states voted against, 12 states were absent. And in particular, the General Assembly reaffirmed its commitment to the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, deplored in the strongest terms the aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine in violation of Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, and deplored the involvement of Belarus in this unlawful use of force against Ukraine. Russia has also been criticized by EU authorities, by the Council of Europe. In fact, Russia seems to leave the Council of Europe by the end of the year. I think it announced that it's going to leave, but according to the procedural requirements, this decision will come into force only later. But it seems that Russia is going to leave the Council of Europe, and that means that Russian citizens will no longer have this possibility to complain against their home country and have their rights protected. So that is the outline of the armed conflict that I wanted to present, and now I will outline Russia's demands against Ukraine and justifications of this armed conflict. Interestingly, Russia has used international law a lot to argue that the full-scale invasion is lawful under international law. So when President Vladimir Putin argued in favor of the invasion, he resorted to a historical claim, particularly that Ukrainian nation is not an independent nation. It has been part of the big Russian nation, Russian people, and that the Ukrainian nation building is in fact essentially an anti-Russian project. And that Vladimir Lenin was one of the masterminds behind the creation of Ukrainian national identity and nation and statehood. So on basis of this argumentation, Vladimir Putin basically denied the existence of the Ukrainian nation as a separate nation and claimed that it is an artificial entity. And Russia has this obligation as the big brother to help and to save the little brother from to discipline the little brother. In addition to the historical claim, there was also a security claim that NATO has been expanding since 1990s to the east. Vladimir Putin refers to an seemingly informal or at least verbal agreement that NATO would not expand, and NATO, according to Vladimir Putin, breached this agreement, and lots of Central and Eastern European countries joined NATO in the last 30 years. And thus, this is a security threat to the Russian Federation. If NATO forces, if Ukraine joins NATO, and NATO forces would be deployed in Ukraine, that would be a very short distance for a missile to fly from Ukraine to Moscow, and it's a big threat to Russia. That's why NATO would never be established, Ukraine would never be part of NATO, and thus Russia has to intervene. So that was the security argument of Vladimir Putin. And finally, most interestingly for us, perhaps the legal argumentation, although one can claim that this legal argumentation is in fact too simplistic, if not a manipulation of legal argumentation. But it's important to note that the legal argumentation was based on Article 51 of the UN Charter, the inherent right to collective self-defense. And thus, according to Kremlin, this is fully in line with the UN Charter. At the same time, the Russian Federation does not call this full-scale invasion a war, or let alone a war of aggression. It is called a special military operation. And there have been, in fact, many cases of arrests in Russia of people who call a war, or a special military operation a war. And the demands that Russia wants Ukraine to comply with are, in light of what I have been saying, the justifications of the invasion: no NATO membership, so Ukraine should have a neutral status. Secondly, Ukraine should recognize Crimea as part of Russia. Ukraine should recognize Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic as sovereign states. And interestingly, within the boundaries of entire Donetsk and Luhansk provinces. And if you look on the map in the PowerPoint, which I shared with you, in the far right of the picture, you see Donetsk and Luhansk, and the Russian military control is in red. However, this is roughly 1/3 of Donetsk and Luhansk provinces. That means that Russia claims that Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic should acquire the entire territories of Donetsk and Luhansk provinces within Ukraine. That is to triple the actual territory they have been controlling for the last 8 years. Then the two most well-known and often repeated arguments of Vladimir Putin are demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. So the goal of this full-scale invasion is to completely destroy Ukrainian armed forces, and then to denazify Ukraine. It's a bit tricky to figure out what Vladimir Putin exactly means by that. I will come a bit later. I'll come to it a bit. I'll discuss it a bit later today. And finally, another demand, which I think was raised only recently, I think yesterday or the day before yesterday, after the third round of talks in Turkey between Ukrainian and Russian ministers of foreign affairs, and that is that Russia wants the Russian language to be the second official language in Ukraine. So far, it has not had such a status. It used to have a regional status for a certain period of time, but never an official status in the entire territory of the country. So on basis of this lengthy introduction, I would like to outline the main challenges to international law posed by this armed conflict, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And the first of them is self-determination. I have already touched upon that several times. The crucial thing is that international law does not provide clear guidance outside the decolonization context. How does self-determination relate to the principle of territorial integrity? So both can be claimed to be principles of international law. In fact, in the Russian legal international law doctrine, if you read Russian textbooks, and pretty much the same, I must say, in Ukrainian textbooks on international law, the principle of self-determination and principle of territorial integrity of states are both at the same level, hierarchical level. So there is no clear rule which of the two prevails. And that helps the Kremlin to prioritize one of the principles if it fits Russian national interests, and deprioritize the very same principle in other contexts. For instance, Russia insists on self-determination of the Crimean people or of the Donbas people. And here it's the tricky question, what is a Donbas people? Because there is not even such a word as Donbas people. You have to say in the Russian language, inhabitants of Donbas. So before 2014, nobody even thought that this could be a people. Pretty much the same about Crimea, although the word Crimeans exists in the Russian language. So the question is, who enjoys this right, the right of self-determination? Which kind of an entity? And it could be easier to claim that Crimeans could enjoy this right. It's a peninsula, this geographical shape of the entity helps the Russian rhetoric to claim that Crimeans enjoy this right. And it's much more complicated, and I'm surprised that Russia still insists on this argument when it comes to the Donbas, Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic. because these are not peoples. So these are just residents of an area, or a part of, or some residents of the area, because not all people in Donbass participated in that referendum, if you can even call it a referendum, several years ago. So the question is, who enjoys this right? And at the same time, Russia does not recognize the right of Chechen people to self-determination. In the 1990s, early 2000s, there were 2 Chechen wars in Russia, and Russia suppressed the desire of the Chechen people to secede with brutal force. There were lots of casualties, both military and civilian casualties. So this cherry picking of one of the 2 principles is a big challenge to international law in light of this armed conflict. The second challenge is the use of force. And here, Russia has not really come up with any innovative argument, such as humanitarian intervention resorted to by, if I'm not mistaken, the UK in 1999 in relation to Kosovo, or the R2P. In fact, in Russian doctrine of international law, humanitarian intervention or the responsibility to protect doctrine have never been appreciated that much. I think in most cases they were discussed with a sort of hostility, as if it's a Western conceptual product. And at the end of the day, Russia resorted to a classical exception on the prohibition of the use of force, and that is right to self-defense, inherent right to collective self-defense. And here the problem, the challenge to international law is the manipulation of this right. So basically, Russia recognized an entity as a sovereign state, and on the very same day, on next day, concluded a bilateral treaty on military assistance, and then resorts to the right to collective self-defense. So from this perspective, international law can be, the international legal order can be easily ruined if any sovereign state can recognize another entity as a sovereign state and quickly use the right to collective self-defense. So that is a big danger. The third challenge to international law concerns war crimes. And here I would like to talk about few issues. The first is pretty much straightforward. There have been allegations of many war crimes in Ukraine, including willful killing, extensive destruction of property not justified by military necessity, compelling a protected person to serve in the armed forces, unlawful deportation, intentional directing of attacks against the civilian population, individual civilian and civilian objects, intentional launching of an attack in the knowledge that such attack would cause incidental loss of life or injury to civilians or damage to civilian objects, or widespread long-term and severe damage to the natural environment, attacking and bombarding of towns, villages, dwellings, or buildings which are undefended and which are not military objectives, intentional direction of attacks against buildings dedicated to religion, education, art, science, historic monuments, hospitals, which are not military objectives, and even pillaging or intentional use of starvation of civilians as a method of warfare. So this list can be continued. I just looked into the Rome Statute, the war crimes that can be committed in an international armed conflict. And these are just a bunch of examples which I have observed in the last couple of weeks watching media. And the problem comes now that there are justifications. Russia resorts to justifications why it has not committed any war crimes in Ukraine. And the Kremlin either denies any bombing of civilian objects or civilians, individual civilians or the civilian population. So there is a complete denial. We are not doing that. And the second, the claim that it's bombing hospitals, maternity wards, schools, because these buildings are allegedly used by Ukrainian armed forces. So these are military objectives. So, and here the question is not about law that much, but about facts and fact finding. So what is actually happening on the ground? Who launches a missile where? This is, I would say, a traditional justification. So I think Russia is not innovative or unique in this respect. This has happened many times in other armed conflicts. What is new to this in these circumstances is the use of modern technology, in my opinion. And this is the establishment of facts on basis of immediately available digital evidence. And there are mutual accusations between Ukraine and Russia, or Russia and the West more generally, that the photos or even videos of ruined hospitals, maternity wards, schools, residential buildings are fakes. So these are not real photos, but fakes, either artificially created photos or photos taken from other armed conflicts or whatever. And there are also potential, I expect that there would be all potential deep fakes, accusations between the parties to the conflict. And the paradox is that there is smartphones are available. Most of Ukrainians possess smartphones with cameras, so they can record videos, take pictures of what's going on the ground. And ordinary people can, in fact, document the commission of war crimes of any party to the conflict. But and there are plenty of photos and videos online, but nobody trusts them. So the question is how to trust. How would you believe that this exact picture or video is actual, genuine, and not a fake? In this regard, paradoxically, the easiest war crimes to be proven would be those allegedly committed by Ukrainian military men. In particular, there was a recent declaration by one of the regiments, I think, or one of the troops of the Ukrainian armed forces, which were appalled by Russia's destruction of civilian objects, and they declared that no quarter will be given. And so that was an official statement of those troops, and which can be argued to be a war crime. Another example of a war crime, which again paradoxically Ukraine would be Ukrainian armed forces, members of armed forces would be guilty of, and these are video interviews with Russian prisoners of war. So they were recorded and uploaded by Ukrainian military men, and such videos are aimed to demonstrate Ukraine's military successes, or demoralize the adversary, and more importantly, perhaps, try to convince ordinary Russians that the full-fledged war is actually going on instead of a special military operation as claimed by the Kremlin. However, such videos violate Article, if I'm not mistaken, 13 of the Third Geneva Convention, which stipulates that prisoners of war must at all times be respected, particularly against insults and public curiosity. The next challenge to international law, which I would like to mention, is genocide. And the prohibition of genocide is well known. According to Article 2 of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, there is a definition of genocide, and it means that any of the acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such, and there is a list of such acts following. And pretty much the same definition is in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. The first and most important point I would like to make regarding the crime of genocide is that Russia has resorted to the genocide claim in justification of its full-scale invasion of Ukraine 2 weeks ago. Basically, this argument has been repeated multiple times by the Central Investigative Committee of the Russian Federation. That's the organ that is responsible for investigations of crimes, as well as by the president of the Russian Federation and many other lawyers in the official or non-official capacities. The problematic aspect of this claim is that Russia does not indicate which of the 4 protected groups are targeted, allegedly targeted by Ukraine. Neither national, nor ethnical, nor racial, nor religious. In fact, Russia coins the 5th group, and that is the linguistic group. And they claim that the Russian-speaking population of Donbass is targeted. which is not in line with international law, nor is it in line with Russian domestic law. The Russian criminal code prohibits the genocide, but it does not include a linguistic group in the definition of this crime. Sometimes Russian lawyers go as far as to claim that the protected group is simply civilians. So Ukrainian armed forces target civilians in Donbass, and that is genocide. So you can see here that the concept of genocide is completely manipulated by the Russian propaganda. That was actually one of the jurisdictional links that Ukraine has used in its recent proceedings. It initiated in the International Court of Justice. I believe Juan Pablo will touch upon that in more detail, that Ukraine claims that Russia resorted to this genocide argument to use force, and it's a very creative argument by the Ukrainian government that the Genocide Convention's jurisdictional link is relevant, and Ukraine can argue that Russia violated the prohibition on the use of force by these false accusations of genocide allegedly committed by Ukrainian government. At the same time, there is the other side of the coin, that in fact, one can claim Russia is committing genocide against Ukrainians, particularly since 24th of February. Perhaps at this stage, it will be difficult to legally argue this. However, the recent events on the battlefield, the siege of Mariupol, indicate that could be plausible. This legal argument could be plausible. One can also recall Putin's beliefs that he expressed in his speech on the 21st of February, if I'm not mistaken, as well as in his written essay he published last summer, where he denies that Ukrainians exist as a separate nation. And one can claim that his denazification argument for the full-scale invasion is essentially a de-Ukrainianization argument. So the Ukrainian population has to be denazified, essentially de-Ukrainianized, to the point where the remaining Ukrainians would agree to be part of the big Russian people. So it's interesting to see how the developments on the battlefield would continue, and whether this claim would become stronger or not. And the final challenge, which I would like to outline in my presentation, concerns information warfare. And there are many aspects to this issue. I would like to outline only a few. So information warfare can be defined as the strategic use of information and disinformation to achieve political and military goals. So thus information is weaponized and people's minds become its main target. So the Russian doctrine of hybrid war, blurring the lines between the state of war and the state of peace, officially and openly prioritizes the role of non-military, particularly information-based means of achieving military ends. And the best examples would perhaps be the Russian claim about its military non-involvement in Donbass for 8 years, or its portrayal of all pro-Ukrainian Ukrainians as neo-Nazis. At the same time, it would be too simplistic to think that this information warfare, which Russia has resorted to through its state media, is only about this information bubble, that people in Russia watch the state TV and they blindly believe what their propaganda has been saying for many years. So one can say that it's a moderate claim would be that the Russian people are victims of this propaganda, and they cannot figure out what's actually happening because they're watching and sincerely believing the state media, and at the same time have limited access to other media or the internet. At the same time, the stronger claim, one could say this was a moderate claim, and the stronger claim would be that this information bubble is in fact not that important. And an average Russian, in fact, supports the war or doesn't care about it or tolerates it. For instance, there are many examples of Russian associations that publicly supported the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in the last couple of weeks. I can give an example of the heads of 250 Russian universities that published an official address by the Union of Russian Rectors of Universities justifying the war and supporting Vladimir Putin's decision. Another example would be like family related. Many relatives of Ukrainians in Russia do not believe that Russia is bombing Ukraine. Because Ukrainians and Russians have many family ties. So when Ukrainians call their relatives in Russia and saying, your government is bombing us, shelling us, and we have to hide in cellars underground, Russian relatives simply do not believe that. And they sincerely believe that there is no war and there is just a special military operation, as the Kremlin narrative goes. And it is aimed to rescue Ukrainians from neo-Nazis and from evil West. And most Russians, in light of these draconian economic sanctions to which I referred to earlier, seemed more concerned by the departure of international consumer brands from Russia than by the horrible international crimes being committed by their armed forces in Ukraine. Very few Russians openly protest, but those who do are threatened and quickly arrested. Today's imperialistic, chauvinistic, and pro-war mood among Russians, as this strong argument can go, did not emerge overnight. So for centuries, Russia has persistently opposed Ukraine's struggle for statehood and prosperity, welfare, and Russians have been encouraged to adopt this condescending view of Ukraine as a younger brother in need of discipline and direction. And for Russia, the existence of a separate Ukrainian nation is by definition an anti-Russian project, and hence it poses an existential threat to Russia. Another dimension of the information warfare is the trustworthiness of Russia. And here I would like to give a few examples, starting from 2014, when Russia occupied Crimea. At the very beginning, Vladimir Putin denied any involvement of Russian armed forces in Crimea, that they were monitoring the referendum with armed forces of Russia. And several months later, the Kremlin admitted that, in fact, Russian armed forces were deployed at the polling stations nearby and controlled the referendum. So at first they denied their military involvement, and then they explicitly admitted that. And similarly with the 2022 full-scale invasion, for many months, while the West was warning the entire world about the potential Russian full-scale invasion, Russian officials, including the president, the foreign minister, explicitly denied Russian plans of a full-scale invasion. And then what happened on the 24th of February, the invasion happened. So the problem is with the trustworthiness of official Russian authorities, and now I would like to conclude briefly about the legal dimension, or international legal dimension of the problem, as well as the information-related dimension of the problem. So the problems with the international legal concepts, such as self-determination, use of force, war crimes, crime of genocide, as well as information warfare, lead to a deep institutional and structural crisis of international law. It did not emerge last month or 2 weeks ago. It has been accumulating the problems for many years. One can claim that what Russia is doing now has been done by the West, by Western countries, particularly by the USA, on multiple occasions. For example, since 1990s, the USA committed like 3 major international attacks without Security Council authorization, that is, the former Yugoslavia, Iraq, and Syria. And Russia has done pretty much the same in at least 3 cases: Georgia in 2008, Crimea, Donbass in 2014, and now full-scale invasion in Ukraine in 2022. Or, for instance, at the Security Council several days ago, the US ambassador denounced Russia for using cluster munitions in Ukraine. Yet the US itself has used cluster bombs in the past, and has refused to join the Convention on Cluster Munitions. So the US was not held responsible for its invasion of Iraq in 2003, and the Security Council failed to condemn Russia for the full-scale invasion of Ukraine today. So the problems have been accumulating for years, and now it seems that the international community has reached that point where international law reforms are urgent, more urgent than ever before. And there would perhaps be a need to reform the United Nations, particularly the P5 system and the veto powers, and to be able to cope with crises of similar scale and magnitude in the future. As claimed by one of the Ukrainian ex-officials, the UN is useless and needs either to be reformed or dismantled with the establishment of a completely new international organization. The enforcement of international law is very weak whenever it concerns the national interests of big powers such as the US, Russia, etc. And the second conclusion that I would like to make, it concerns information. It's not about law that much. It does concern law to a certain extent, but it's more about information and fact-finding. A lot of legal arguments would be easily resolved if both parties to the armed conflict, Ukraine and Russia, agreed on the facts, what is happening on the ground. So which armed forces are shelling which place and whether it's a civilian object or not. And here there is a need for some impartial, neutral organizations, entities that would be able to establish these facts which everybody would trust. So the problem is both with legal and factual things. So thank you very much for your attention. I think I exceeded my time. And if you have any questions, I would be very happy to answer them in the Q&A session.
Many thanks, Sergey. We are extremely grateful for such a comprehensive and accurate presentation of the situation in Ukraine from different perspectives, going all the way from historical, international relations to international law elements. We are once again extremely indebted to you for such a clear presentation. Our next speaker will focus on a previous situation, the situation in his country, Georgia, and how that is related actually to the ongoing full-scale invasion by Russia in Ukraine and possible ramifications for other countries, mainly Baltic states. We have, therefore, Mr. Georgi Chakvadze from Georgia, who is a doctoral candidate in international law at Tbilisi State University, Georgia. He's also a lecturer at different universities and academic institutions in Georgia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Without further ado, we give the floor to Mr. Chakvadze for between 15-20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, dear Juan, for this nice introduction. Today, I will deal basically about legal aspects of 2008 Georgia-Russian war. But when we speak about the Georgian-Russian conflict, we should always keep in mind that it started from 1991 when Georgia started fighting for its independence. So it's not a conflict which started in 2008, of course. But basically, in this presentation, I will deal with some important legal aspects of this concept, preconditions and the war itself. First of all, I will speak about the passportization policy of the Russian Federation in Georgia and legally assess it. And I will also make comparative analysis with Ukrainian case because my colleague was dealing with Ukrainian case, and I will also make some comparative analysis in this regard because it has some similarities. It has to do some similarities with passportization policy in Ukraine and Georgia. Of course, also I will speak about some important aspects of Taliaferro's report and how it deals with this conflict, how it assesses, and what are the confusing points of Taliaferro's report. And finally, I will assess Russia's intervention in Georgia from the perspective of the prohibition of the use of force, and assess whether Russia's arguments are justified or not, and how Russia's arguments relate to the Ukrainian case also, because Russia raises similar arguments in the case of Ukraine. So I will basically deal with this issue. So we know that at the beginning of the 21st century, Russian Federation issued the law on citizenship, which entered into force in 2008. And the aim of this law on citizenship was that it served as a pivot for Russia's new political plans in the Georgian territories of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Namely, with this law and with this passportization policy, Russia tried to take away Georgian citizens from Georgia, and it served ultimately its legal argument for Russian political leaders to justify its military intervention in 2008. And we are constantly witnessing starting from 2008 that official Kremlin representatives, we are repeatedly stating that they were protecting Russian population in Abkhazia and Ossetia and giving this Russian passport to not just Russian citizens, but to Russian-speaking persons. But when doing this, they never mentioned about the conformity of this passportization policy with international law, with Georgian law, or even with Russian law. And this passportization policy has many similarities. With the case of Ukraine, because the same holds true for Ukraine. Because in Ukraine, starting from 2000, the Russian government began creating its compatriot organization and culture centers in Ukraine and supplying them with legal, financial, logistical, and organizational support. It also created like paramilitary organizations and started their training. And one of the salient examples of this of Russian activities is 2008, when Russian Federation created separatist organization in Ukraine, Donetsk Republic, in Russian Donetskaya Republika, which also served as an example of such separatist organization. So both in cases of Georgia and in cases of Ukraine, to make a comparative analysis, we witness this huge, this vast passportization effort from Russian Federation, which was systemic distribution of Russian passports and citizenship to ethnic Russians, Russian citizens, and even to only just Russian speakers. And Russia's argument was that it was protecting Russian population. So now let's move to the legal point, legal side of this policy, and it says, how justified was Russian policy? We know that from legal, before analyzing the legality of Russia's passportization policy in Georgia and Russia, we should define the concept of citizenship. We know that from legal perspective, citizenship is a legal and political connection of a person with a particular state, which has basically three fundamental aspects. First of all, citizenship is regulated by the state. Citizenship presents and characterizes of this relationship, the strength of relations between persons and state. And thirdly, citizenship means division of responsibilities and rights between state and a particular person. And we also know that there are three basic types of citizenship: general rule, citizenship by birth, and naturalization. And basically, the policy which was pursued by Russian Federation was based on the naturalization procedure. And by this procedure, the competent authority of state gives citizenship to a particular person who has important contribution with this particular state. But the question is whether Russia's passportization policy came in conformity with the fundamental rules of international law, Georgian law, and even of Russian law. Because you know that Article 14 of the Russian law on citizenship states that Russian Federation may grant to persons citizenship, Russian citizenship, who held USSR citizenship had resided in the former territory of the USSR and are currently residing in this territory and did not acquire the citizenship of these states and are thus stateless persons. But these persons were residing in the territories of Georgia and in the territories of Ukraine. And even if you look, for instance, to Talavini Commission's report, Talavini's report accentuates that, and it recognizes Georgian territory in its sovereign borders and says that Georgian territory is recognized under the Constitution of Georgia adopted on 1995. So Talavini reports reinforces once again argument for the territorial integrity of Georgia and says that this territorial integrity and sovereignty of Georgia is recognized by states as well as international organizations. So at least Talavini's report opposes Russia's argument and Russia's illegal passportization policy in Georgia. And also, let's now look what is written in Georgia's legislation itself. If you look at Georgia's legislation, we find out two important aspects. First of all, Georgian legislation prohibits double citizenship. So a person may not be double citizenship, with the exception of one case when the president of Georgia gives citizenship to a person based on his merits to a particular country. Otherwise, a person may not be a double citizenship. And the second important aspect of Georgian legislation, which once again stresses illegality of Russian passportization policy, is that neither Abkhazians nor Ossetians had expressed their desire in a written form to revoke their Georgian citizenship, which once again stresses that the Russian passportization policy was illegal. And even this Russian passportization policy is against Russian law, because these persons were living in the territories of Georgia. So this legislation requirement of Georgian and international law should be taken into consideration. And we know that Talavini report also concludes that Russia's policy, passportization policy in Georgia, was illegal. And we can say by analogy that the same holds true for Ukraine. So let's now move to the some important aspects of Talavini report. Apart from illegality of Russia's passportization policy, Talavini report has some confusing claims in my view. On the one hand, Talavini report once again stresses that the demand for self-determination of Abkhazians and South Ossetians are illegal, because the right of self-determination should be accomplished within domestic framework and not through secessionist means. And the Talavini report clearly states that this right of self-determination in these regions were accomplished by secessionist means. And of course, we know that when there are threats, when there are weapons, you can't exercise freely the right of self-determination. So this report stresses on the illegality of this process and stresses that these are basically Georgian territories. It also, Talavini's report also focuses on the restoration of military railway to Abkhazia by the Russian Federation, which ultimately served for Russian Federation to deploy its troops in this region. But there are two confusing claims, in my view, in Talavini's report. The first confusing claim in this report is that it stresses that Georgia side attacked on August 7 the Russian army, and it says that it contradicted Georgian-Russian agreement. And it also says, second confusing claim, where it states that while not an independent state, South Ossetia was like structurally independent from Georgia. So it says that Georgia's armed response may be considered as aggression and invasion of a state. But it's a nonsense in my view, because we know, if you look at the argumentation of international legal scholarship and Antonio Cassese, for instance, it says and recognizes that Georgian territory is sovereignty. So Georgia had right to establish order in Tskhinvali region and Abkhazia, so because it was its territories. And it also, this claim made by Talavini report, its contradiction with several UN General Assembly resolutions, where these resolutions also recognize the full sovereignty and territorial integrity of Georgian territory. So in Talavini report, we have some contradicting and confusing reports, which may not come in conformity with international law because Georgia was exercising its right of self-defense. So let's now analyze how Russia's action in the territories of Georgia came in contradiction with the prohibition of the use of force. We know that UN, the legal basis of the prohibition of the use of force is Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, which prohibits the use of force or use of threat. And as analogy of Nicaragua case, it may be considered as a use Congress norm. And we know that there are two justifications and not exceptions from this prohibition, general prohibition of the use of force. That is self-defense and Security Council authorization. But we also know that in order the right of self-defense to be effective, to come, to come into force, additional criteria should be met. So there should be an actual attack against the state, including from regular or non-regular forces. And secondly, it should be necessary, which means that there should be no other alternatives, that is diplomatic or political ones, and it should be proportional. It means that it should come in conformity, the action should come in conformity with the actions. So let's now assess Russia's actions from the standpoint of international law. First of all, we can say that in the case of Georgia, for Russia to exercise the right of self-defense, Russia was not a victim state. Russia was not attacked by Georgia. So Russia's argument that it was protecting Georgian it was protecting Russian citizens in these regions is out of order. It's out of international law because Russia was not attacked by Georgia. So there should be an attack against the state, and it was not the case. And so Russia was not a victim case. Secondly, there was not even a threat of attack against Russia. And even if there was a threat against Russia, Russia has not exhausted all peaceful means, all diplomatic, political, other means to resolve such threat. So Russia's argument that it was protecting its citizens in light of self-defense, it's not in conformity with international law. And we make, in this sense, we may make some parallels with the case of Ukraine. Because what was the Russians' arguments in case of Ukraine? And we saw these arguments even from Putin's speech. For instance, you see here that Putin was talking that the people, republics of Donbass, turned to Russia with a request for help. So the first argument of Russia was the Donbass people defense argument. And the second main argument was the self-defense argument, which is also enshrined in the speech of Putin, where he says that, I repeat, our actions are self-defense against the threats posed us from greater disasters than what is happening today. So if you look of Russia's arguments from the perspective of preemptive self-defense, we can say that there was no imminent, as in case of Georgia, in this case also, there was no imminent armed attack against Russia to prove that Russia's response was realization of the right of self-defense. So Russia's argument in Ukraine based on preemptive self-defense argument is very weak to be justified. Secondly, Russia said that Russia based its argument on collective self-defense argument. But in order this argument to be strong, Donetsk and Lugansk regions should be states, but in fact, Donetsk and Lugansk are sovereign, are just regions of the sovereign country Ukraine. They are not independent states, of course. So as Donetsk and Lugansk are not states, to use collective self-defense arguments. And even if we presume, even if we legally presume that Donetsk and Lugansk are states, it's quite contested how Russian goal of demilitarization of Ukraine is in conformity with international law, because in any case, demilitarization of Ukraine, as was discussed by Mr. Masol, of course, may not be justified by Russian Federation. And also, the third arguments of Russia is that they may base their arguments on humanitarian intervention doctrine. But when we speak about humanitarian intervention doctrine, which one can take into consideration that it's a new concept, and there's no like strong humanitarian intervention argument in international law. There's something that humanitarian intervention argument, and that Russia is acting to stop or prevent a genocide of Russians in eastern Ukraine. But again, in this case, the basic problem is that the humanitarian intervention is rejected as a valid exception from the prohibition of the use of force by vast majority of international law, because Russia violated the prohibition of the use of force, and Russia's actions in Ukraine was aggression. So it's very contested how Russia could justify its military intervention as based on humanitarian intervention arguments. So Russia's arguments based on preemptive self-defense, collective self-defense argument, or humanitarian interventions arguments may not be justified by international law. It presents aggression in the sense of international law, and we find many similarities with the case of Georgia. And finally, I wanted to discuss this, because I'm the lecturer of different universities in the Baltic states. I wanted to discuss some threats which are posed to Baltic states as well, because Baltic states are now, as experts say, a threat to be attacked by Russia, and this military intervention and Russia's provocative actions may break out in Baltic states. And why Baltic states are so important in this case? We know that when Russia invaded Crimea, this aggression of Russian side, this invasion of Crimea, was one of the largest territories which Russia occupied after World War II. And we also know that in Crimea there was Russian population, about 60%. Yes, we can say that in Baltic states there's also Russian population, and there's 25% of Russian population. So these regions are also threats. In Baltic states, Russian Federation may also use its passportization policy as it delivered in Georgia and Ukraine. So there's threats that Russia may use its provocative actions. There's a threat that in Baltic states, Russia may use the same scenario by creating like its compatriot organizations, its propagandic organizations, to justify its potential military intervention in these countries. We also should take into consideration the geographic disadvantage of Baltic states, because we know that Baltic states are close to the Kaliningrad, which are military equipped by Russia, which is like strongly equipped by Russian Federation. So who knows if Russia accomplishes its plan, and if the international community will not stop Russia's actions, the next step may be Baltic states. So because it accomplished, we find many similarities between Russia's illegal actions in Georgia and in case of Ukraine, which Sergei Masol has greatly discussed with us. So who knows, maybe the next step, the next threat, maybe Baltic state. These are the basic issues about the 2008 Georgian-Russia conflict I wanted to discuss, and making some parallel with the case of Ukraine and Baltic state. It was my pleasure to meet you today, and if you have questions, I will be happy to answer. Thank you so much.
Many thanks, George, for your accurate presentation, which connects the situation in your country, in the Baltic states, with the crisis and atrocities being committed right now in Ukraine, unfortunately. Now it's my turn. As I mentioned, I am Juan Pablo Perez Leon, and I am a lecturer and researcher at the University of Jyväskylä in Finland. So in about 15 minutes, I will try to summarize what are the justice for victims of atrocities mechanisms, considering the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So now I will proceed to share my screen. Maybe, George, you can stop sharing your screen.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can stop, please. Yeah, thank you. Let's see. Okay, I believe that you can now see my screen. Basically, there are two main categories of mechanisms. The first one corresponds to criminal justice mechanisms. The center of gravity has been certainly the International Criminal Court, the ICC. Although Ukraine is not a state party to the ICC, there has been already a situation in Ukraine as a result of a couple of declarations filed by Ukraine that enable the exercise of the ICC's jurisdiction. More importantly is the fact that there has been a referral by a number of states of the now situation in Ukraine to the ICC, which has speeded up actually the possibility for the ICC's prosecutor to already start this investigation. It's important to keep in mind that Russia is not a state party to the ICC statute, and the other option would have been a referral by the Security Council, where precisely Russia is one of the 5 permanent members and can always exercise the right to veto. But there we have already a very powerful quasi-global mechanism, which is the ICC, already involved actually in investigations that should lead to prosecution, trial, and later convictions of those who are most responsible for the atrocities committed in Ukraine by Russian armed forces. But the focus of the ICC's work will be on the 3 major categories of international crimes, namely genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Although the ICC has also acquired jurisdiction over the crime of aggression, there are a number of jurisdictional limits which makes the threshold to trigger the jurisdiction over that said crime very challenging. In that context is that a number of scholars and leading practitioners have very recently suggested the creation of a special tribunal for the crime of aggression concerning the situation in Ukraine. If this tribunal comes to fruition, we will have then 2 institutions, the ICC taking care of the crimes of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity on the one hand, and this prospective ad hoc special tribunal taking care of aggression. Nevertheless, there are also already critical voices about the feasibility or even advisability of creating or establishing a new tribunal, because that may lead to further atomization or fragmentation of already large number of international mechanisms. A third mechanism within the criminal justice options corresponds to a prospective international and independent and impartial investigative mechanism. The idea of this kind of investigative mechanisms is to gather, to collect evidence and to preserve that evidence for the future, for future trials that can take place at the national or a regional or international level. Why is that important? The experience of Syria has shown us that many years can pass before international or national trial will take place. So during those years, there is a high risk that evidence can be lost forever. That's why it's important to consider also these kind of mechanisms to collect the evidence, to gather the evidence, to preserve the evidence, so that no matter how many years in the future we will finally have international or national criminal trials in Syria and now in Ukraine, justice can be best served. A fourth important mechanism that shouldn't be underestimated is the exercise of criminal jurisdiction by national courts, by national authorities. This can be exercised on a number of grounds, including the traditional links based on nationality of the victim, the nationality of the perpetrator, the place of commission of the crimes, or other extended jurisdictional links, such as universal jurisdiction. In other words, a domestic court can exercise jurisdiction over the atrocities being committed in Ukraine, regardless of the nationality of the perpetrator, the nationality of the victim, or the location of the crime. In Latin America, for example, Argentinian authorities have recently started using universal jurisdiction mechanisms or proceedings related to the atrocities which had been committed against the Rohingya people in Myanmar. So that is important to keep in mind, I mean, especially from the Latin American perspective, because universal jurisdiction gained a lot of traction during the 80s and early 2000s, when a number of countries, among others, Belgium, the Nordic countries, Switzerland, etc., exercise or try to exercise universal jurisdiction over individuals who were accused of atrocities related to the Balkan Wars in the 90s and also the horrible genocidal massacre that took place in Rwanda in 1994. But although criminal justice mechanisms are necessary, are insufficient, especially from a victim-centered approach to international law. We need to consider also a wide array of additional options, which shouldn't be mutually exclusive with the previous deterrent and retributive justice mechanisms. Among others, we have, in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, proceedings filed by Ukraine against Russia before the International Court of Justice concerning the application, interpretation of the Convention Against Genocide. And at this moment, that concerns mainly the adoption of urgent provisional measures to stop or to order Russia from further inflicting harm on victims in Ukraine. Nevertheless, the problem here is that from a victim's perspective, there is an interstate mechanism that doesn't have victims as the main actors. In other words, the litigation proceedings concerns litigation between Ukraine versus Russia. As a result of that, if Russia is found internationally responsible for violations of the Genocide Convention, Russia will be ordered to pay compensation awards to the state of Ukraine, but not directly to the victims, to Ukrainian victims, who in the end are the most affected individuals. In that sense, we need to explore other mechanisms. But in any case, it's important to keep in mind that the International Court of Justice recently ordered its very first compensation award against Uganda for our activities in Congo concerning gross, large-scale violations, serious violations of human rights and international humanitarian law, which are also constitutive of international crimes. So that decision came just last month, in February 2022. So in that sense, that is an important precedent to consider. The European Court of Human Rights, of course, is a natural place for victims of human rights violations, and right now perpetrated in Ukraine, to file against Russia. But as Sergi Massol already mentioned, it's very likely that Russia will denounce the European Convention on Human Rights, will leave the Council of Europe, and that will mean that not only Russian people will be unprotected from this supranational mechanism, but also Ukrainians who could have legitimately activate some proceedings against the Russian state for serious violations right now being committed in Ukraine. However, it's important to keep in mind that it takes some time before the date in which actually that potential, very likely withdrawal from the European Convention on Human Rights takes place. Until that exact day in which that withdrawal finally takes effect, Ukrainian citizens will be able actually to present complaints against the Russian Federation. And that can lead to the termination of the Russian state responsibility, and the European Court, for those cases, should order reparations. The European Court has normally ordered compensation. Then we had also United Nations human rights treaty bodies. Treaty bodies, in this case, such as the Human Rights Committee, the Committee Against Torture, which are the guardians of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as well as the Convention Against Torture. Both Ukraine and Russia are state parties to those treaties. Interestingly enough, however, unlike Ukraine, the Russian Federation is not party to the International Convention Against Enforced Disappearance of People. Then we have international fact-finding missions, which are normally organized by the United Nations, and these missions have proven to be very useful to identify a number of elements, including potential evidence-sharing material and also issuing some recommendations, especially in Africa and also in the Middle East, in recent humanitarian crises. That can also complement the efforts in order to find the truth, no? What exactly is taking place in Ukraine. Then we have mechanisms which are more related to transitional justice. In this context, Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. Truth and Reconciliation Commissions are by definition transitional justice institutions which can be eventually backed up by international organizations. For example, in the Latin American experience, in El Salvador, United Nations was directly involved. And due to the large scale and impact of the atrocities being committed in Ukraine, probably it would be necessary to have a very close synergy between national, regional, and of course, international actors if Truth and Reconciliation Commissions are considered as an option. And in the end, try to achieve some level of healing in years to come between two nations, Ukraine and Russia, that because of the presence of this this individual basically are now in such a bloody war, in such a bloody large-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russian forces. Then we have mechanisms that had to do with what I refer to as the reparative or restorative justice dimension of international law. Much emphasis has been put on deterrence, punishing, sanctioning, etc., which is absolutely necessary, but in my opinion, still insufficient. We need to once again have the victims of these atrocities, my opinion, as the center of gravity of all efforts of the international community. In the light of that consideration, we have the need to explore compensation claims commissions, where the victims can actually file complaints and receive not only money, but also other modalities of reparations, such as rehabilitation, satisfaction, restitution of property, and guarantees of non-repetition. And the same comes true for the establishment of national reparation programs. When it comes to compensation claims commission, attention should be drawn to the United Nations Compensation Commission that was established in the aftermath of another illegal invasion, that one led by the late dictator Saddam Hussein, Iraq, of Kuwait in 1990. There is an important law and practice of the United Nations Compensation Claims Commission, which integrates a wide array of atrocities, not only war crimes, crimes against humanity, but also the illegal use of armed force. Then we have, and finally, national civil damages litigation. In this context, much has been said about criminal universal jurisdiction. But again, we should also consider universal civil litigation. That means that individuals, plaintiffs, can present claims to receive compensation, mainly to get their harm redressed. The United States actually has led the way by for a number of years concerning this kind of judgments or decisions, awards, in which American courts had actually ordered compensation awards for victims due to or related to atrocities committed overseas around the world. However, due to different implementation problems, that set of awards hasn't been successful in practice. But again, that is another avenue to explore to deliver a restorative justice, which is a pressing issue for victims. Finally, other points to consider include the following, in my understanding. Reading the tons and tons of posts and tweets from distinguished academics and practitioners, my impression is that the debate is still within the box of traditional categories of international law. In this case, the traditional and most important subjects of international law for this kind of issues is states and individuals under liability. That again is absolutely needed, but is still, in my opinion, insufficient. We need to start thinking outside the box and try to, once and for all, to identify liability beyond these major subjects, major actors. And the big elephant in the room is certainly corporations. Corporations have been present in a number of previous conflicts, and we have actually all this cluster of oligarchs that belong to the Russian elite. It will be very important, in my opinion, to see actually how all these seized properties, assets, etc., can actually contribute towards reparative justice in favor of victims, or in general, reconstruction of Ukraine in years to come. Finally, we need also to consider a multi-layer levels of analysis of victimhood. By far, and of course, individuals, human beings like us, are the most important victims of all these atrocities. However, we also need to keep in mind other potential categories of victimhood. For instance, cultural property. There are cultural sites which have been targeted or may potentially be targeted in the current war perpetrated by Russia against Ukraine, which are registered in UNESCO, in the UNESCO list of cultural heritage sites. Under the ICC's law and jurisprudence, these historical and religious monuments are actually victims themselves, or should be considered victims themselves. So unfortunately, when these atrocities take place, we had a criminal package of serious abuses, not only murders, destruction of cities and attacks against civilian population, but also gender and sexual-based violence, which unfortunately happens, and destruction of cultural property. But also another category of victimhood mentioned already by Massol, is the environment. This conflict, this invasion has those elements. There is already some concerning incidents of nuclear contamination and potentially even the use of chemical weapons, which certainly not only affect humans, but the ecosystem, which as such must be protected even and regardless of the effects on humans. International humanitarian law protects the environment, not only because of the effects on us humans, but also because due to the protection of the environment by the sake of the environment itself. Well, those are just some thoughts. Now I will we will transition now to the block in Spanish. And so now I will give the floor first to Daniela. So from this moment onwards, I will start talking in Spanish, but after Daniela's presentation and Carolina Loaiza's presentation, we will open the floor for a round of questions, both in English and Spanish. Daniela, in Spanish now, Daniela is fine, a little bit. Oye, tengo tantas ventanas que un momentito. Ya. Estoy justo. Ya. Daniela Malapi Hernández, disculpen por la demora. Es de Perú, docente en Derecho Internacional Público y en la Universidad Tecnológica de Perú, Facultad de Derecho, y es directora de diseño académico en la misma universidad. Por favor, Daniela, por 15 minutos tienes la palabra. Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Juan Pablo. Para mí es un enorme placer participar en este foro. Quiero agradecer también a la Academia Online, que es la organización en Argentina que nos ha permitido también hacer este evento, y por supuesto al profesor Sergei Majkol y Georgi Yakbatse. We are very grateful for your kindness and greatly appreciate your willingness to participate in this academic event to address topics of special relevance. I am sure that the audience has been very attentive to your valuable opinions on the conflict to continue deepening later. Entonces, bueno, mi presentación, como bien dijo Juan Pablo, es en español. En realidad voy a tratar de ser breve porque estamos en el tiempo y creo que va a haber un espacio para preguntas. Entonces, como bien se ha mencionado, el conflicto, bueno, data de un tiempo bastante anterior. Recordemos que con la desmembración de la ex Unión de Repúblicas Socialistas Soviéticas en 1991, los cruces políticos, económicos, entre las 15 repúblicas independientes, principalmente en su relación con Rusia, pues ha sido evidente, ¿no? Y los hechos que hoy pues podemos nosotros evidenciar a través de diversos medios y fuentes es también una muestra de que es a partir del año prácticamente 2008 cuando se ve la posibilidad de que Ucrania realice un entendimiento más cercano con la Unión Europea, los Estados Unidos, la OTAN, obviamente. Es que a nivel interno se dan ciertos enfrentamientos entre quienes eran pro-Europa y pro-Rusia en el denominado Euromaidán para definir realmente cuál iba a ser el camino hacia la política interna y exterior de Ucrania. No voy a entrar mucho en este detalle porque los profesores que son originarios también de estas zonas han podido explayarse Perdón, tengo encargado a mi mascotito, así que hay unos gritos ahí, disculpen la interrupción. Bueno, y perdón.
Mientras tanto, voy anunciando, hay un link para las formas, los que quieran recibir certificados, pueden ver el link que Jorge Joel Pesante ha publicado, entonces tienen que hacer clic en el link para que reciban su certificado. In English, just in case, as I announced at the beginning of this event, there is now a form for those of you who would like to receive a certificate for your attendance. You just need to check what has been posted by Jorge Joel Pesar. Thank you. Please. Okay. Daniela, back to you.
Sí, ruego mil disculpas por este impasse involuntario y continúo. Bien, para entrar entonces en contexto, toda guerra, todo conflicto armado, para hablar con mayor propiedad, siempre tiene una causa y un efecto. Lo hemos visto históricamente como en la Primera Guerra Mundial, el pretexto fue el atentado en Sarajevo contra el archiduque Francisco Fernando, pero la causa principal fue el conflicto permanente entre Alemania por el control del mercado, con Gran Bretaña, que lo dominaba en ese tiempo, ¿no? Lo mismo por su lado Rusia y el Imperio Austrohúngaro, que disputaban el control de los Balcanes. En la Segunda Guerra Mundial vimos lo mismo, ¿no? El pretexto, el incidente en Polonia, que causó posteriormente que Alemania le invadiera. Obviamente la causa era el desarrollo armamentista, el afán expansionista de Alemania, y ahora vemos que sucede exactamente lo mismo, ¿no? Putin, el presidente Putin, ha exigido el compromiso de no expandir la OTAN y que se lo pongan por escrito, ¿no? Pero la causa real es que el hecho de que Ucrania se convierta en una democracia independiente ya es un sujeto de derecho internacional consolidado, tiene personalidad jurídica y el derecho propio que le da la Carta de Naciones Unidas de elegir sus rumbos, tiene derecho al desarrollo y a pertenecer a los organismos internacionales que defina, ha resultado inaceptable para el gobierno de Rusia, ¿no? Entonces, el trasfondo es que la negativa de Rusia de aceptar el acercamiento de la OTAN y la Unión Europea a Ucrania es evidente, ¿no? Moscú considera a Ucrania parte de su identidad, ¿no? Y sobre todo su espacio de mayor influencia. Recordemos que Ucrania comparte con Rusia 2.000 kilómetros de frontera, ¿no? Entonces, obviamente el tema de la seguridad a Rusia le ha servido como tema para empezar con este proceso de invasión, ¿no? Inclusive, algo que cuesta un poco entender también es cómo Rusia ha podido expresar las exigencias para terminar el conflicto por parte de Ucrania en el sentido de no ingresar a la OTAN, ¿no? Pide que Ucrania inclusive enmiende la Constitución para renunciar a su ingreso a cualquier bloque, ¿no? Reconozca la independencia, obviamente, de Crimea y del Donbass. Entonces vemos cómo Rusia es miembro de Naciones Unidas, es miembro del Consejo de Seguridad de Naciones Unidas, con derecho a veto, como ya es sabido, y por tanto es un sujeto que al ser fundacional de un organismo internacional con tanta trayectoria y tanto impacto en la comunidad internacional, a la vez vulnera de manera fehaciente los principios básicos del derecho internacional. El derecho internacional no acepta, no reconoce que dentro de un Estado se puedan configurar sucesiones de Estado. Recordemos, para los que estamos un poco ligados a la temática del derecho internacional, que la sucesión a Estados es la posibilidad de crear nuevos Estados, sea por desmembramiento, como pasó con la URSS, sea por anexión o por independencia de una colonia. Pero lo que no se acepta es que un Estado nacional pueda reivindicar una soberanía, una independencia de un Estado ya consagrado. Lo hemos visto hace años, por ejemplo, con las intenciones de Cataluña respecto de España de querer independizarse, y generó un impacto en la comunidad internacional. Esa intención de independencia no iba a ser reconocida. Lo mismo entonces sucede con Ucrania, ¿no? Por más que Crimea haya, a través del referéndum, determinado que quería independizarse del Estado, o la zona del Donbass, no es un contexto que se pueda reconocer desde el derecho internacional. Repito, si se tratara de un Estado que se encuentra en condición de colonia, que hoy en día quedan muy pocos Estados, que dependan de una metrópoli, bueno, ahí hablaríamos de un contexto sí de reconocimiento, pero en el contexto en el que estamos ahora, definitivamente no. Entonces, vemos que hay vulneraciones flagrantes al ordenamiento jurídico internacional. De hecho, hay organismos que se han pronunciado al respecto, por ejemplo, la OCDE, que es un organismo al que Rusia desea también integrar, ha sido muy clara, ¿no? Ha habido una respuesta a la enorme agresión de Rusia contra Ucrania y este organismo ha decidido suspender de inmediato la participación de Rusia y también de Bielorrusia en los organismos de la OCDE. Mientras no sean miembros, sí hay posibilidad de colaboración, pero inclusive este espacio de colaboración ha sido suspendido. A solicitud de Ucrania también se ha podido recurrir a la Corte Internacional de Justicia, ¿no? De hecho, este 7 de marzo se han celebrado audiencias públicas, lamentablemente Rusia no participó, ¿no? Pero esta demanda que ha interpuesto Ucrania también ha sido reforzada por solicitudes de medidas provisionales, ¿no? Obviamente estamos en un escenario de emergencia y este procedimiento de medidas provisionales permite al Estado afectado recurrir a esta instancia jurisdiccional para tomar medidas de urgencia, ¿no? Por su parte, Rusia ha presentado excepciones preliminares para cuestionar la competencia de la Corte, ¿no? Entonces esto obviamente va a tener cierto camino a recorrer para un pronunciamiento al respecto. Ahora, considerando la urgencia de esta situación y la falta de la contraargumentación de Rusia, es posible, a mi juicio, que en algunas semanas la Corte Internacional de Justicia pueda ordenar justamente estas medidas provisionales solicitadas por Ucrania dentro del marco institucionalmente dado para un proceso contencioso como el que se está convocando en este contexto. Entonces, si se dan estas medidas provisionales, vamos a tener un escenario, al menos desde el plano institucional, jurisdiccional, que pueda sostener y amparar a Ucrania en este contexto de conflicto, ¿no? De otro lado, el Consejo de Derechos Humanos de Naciones Unidas, también respecto de la agresión militar de Rusia, ha aprobado hace poco, el 4 de marzo, también un mecanismo de investigación, ¿no? Porque se está percibiendo de manera clara graves violaciones al derecho internacional humanitario, ¿no? El profesor Sergei hizo una explicación bastante importante sobre este tema. Obviamente, el probar, ¿no? Y tener evidencia sobre estas violaciones es lo más fuerte, lo más complicado, pero yo creo que hay bastante material que luego la Corte va a poder merituar, ¿no? Y el Consejo también. Es de observarse entonces que mientras Rusia, como, repito, parte integrante del Consejo de Seguridad, fundante de la Organización de las Naciones Unidas, vulnera el ordenamiento jurídico internacional, Ucrania más bien, contando con aliados que se han expresado a favor de su soberanía, de su integridad territorial, activa diversas instancias internacionales, ¿no? Recurre a mecanismos jurisdiccionales predeterminados dentro del marco legal, y obviamente los países que acompañan sus peticiones, bueno, han generado una serie de sanciones económicas y comerciales que no han tenido mayor precedente en los últimos años, ¿no? Entonces, es importante anotar esta diferencia en el accionar, ¿no? Mientras Rusia más bien prefiere inclinarse hacia el uso de la fuerza, hacia el atentado a la paz y seguridad internacionales, Ucrania más bien se apoya en los mecanismos institucionales y de cooperación política y jurisdiccional para hacer frente a esta situación, no obstante la defensa militar que todos estamos viendo que se está suscitando dentro de su territorio. Un tema importante también es la respuesta, y con esto termino, es la respuesta de América Latina a esta situación, ¿no? Hace poco hemos visto cómo Estados Unidos se ha acercado a Venezuela, siendo Venezuela uno de los pilares centrales de apoyo en esta región, ¿no? Rusia más bien es el complemento político-militar y juega un rol importantísimo en este país. Entonces, el acercamiento de Washington suscita algunas interrogantes, toda vez de que siempre Estados Unidos ha tenido una posición de no reconocimiento al gobierno venezolano, ¿no? Obviamente los rusos no se han quedado atrás, porque al tiempo que Washington ha enviado representantes para tener conversaciones con el gobierno, los rusos han hecho lo mismo por su parte, ¿no? En el caso de Colombia, nosotros sabemos que más bien la relación es más hacia los Estados Unidos, ¿no? Iván Duque, desde el comienzo del conflicto, ha mostrado un rechazo del accionar ruso, más bien apoyando a las iniciativas de la Unión Europea, los Estados Unidos obviamente, por ser un socio estratégico en la región. Pero lo que sí suscita cierta inquietud es que Colombia está próxima a celebrar campaña electoral, ¿no? Y uno de las opciones con una fuerte posibilidad de triunfo la tiene Gustavo Petro, que como sabemos tiene una opción de izquierda bastante marcada, ¿no? Entonces se esperaría que este candidato de tomar la presidencia tenga una posición más distante de Washington, pero vamos a ver cómo se suscita también este proceso, ¿no? Por su parte, bueno, el líder ecuatoriano también ha mostrado una condena explícita a Rusia, lo mismo el gobierno de Uruguay. Y en Chile, más bien, se ha visto una posición también un poco inquietante, en el sentido de que sabemos que Gabriel Boric, recientemente elegido presidente de Chile, es también de una tendencia de izquierda, pero ha mostrado un rechazo abierto a la posición de Moscú. No obstante, obviamente ha habido ciertas reticencias entre los miembros de su coalición, ¿no? Pero el no incluir, por ejemplo, en la ceremonia de ayer, ¿no? de la toma de mando a gobiernos como Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, da también que pensar sobre una nueva política de izquierda en América Latina, que podría luego generar también una posición distinta respecto de la posición de Chile respecto del conflicto de Ucrania y Rusia. Y bueno, México, obviamente, siempre México ha tenido una política exterior basada en el respeto a los asuntos internos de los estados. Se ha negado a imponer sanciones económicas a Rusia y más bien ha insistido en mantener buenas relaciones con todos los gobiernos, ¿no? Entonces ahí la expresión ha sido un poquito más neutral, ¿no? Yo quiero terminar con una expresión que hace poco también hemos sido testigos acerca de la invitación del gobierno ruso de invitar a Alain Pellet, ¿no? Abogado internacionalista muy famoso, que también, bueno, en el caso peruano tuvo un rol importantísimo en la demanda sobre el conflicto de delimitación marítima Perú-Chile, ¿no? Él mencionaba una traducción más o menos hecha desde el francés, que los abogados pueden defender causas más o menos cuestionables, pero se ha vuelto imposible representar en los foros dedicados a la aplicación de la ley a un país que tan cínicamente lo desprecia. Entonces, yo creo que con esto, cerrando, nos debemos quedar todos aquellos que somos hombres y mujeres de derecho, ¿no? Analizar la situación, y ese también es una forma de comprometernos con lo que está pasando ahora. No estamos en la zona, evidentemente, y felizmente, también, no obstante, nuestra empatía con el gobierno ucraniano, particularmente, lo menciono, con el pueblo ucraniano y también con el pueblo ruso que está en contra de este conflicto, ¿no? Pero desde el plano jurídico debemos también saber diferenciar, ¿no? y utilizar siempre el razonamiento institucional para poder pensar, debatir, discutir soluciones a problemas tan graves como el que nos convoca este tiempo presente. Muchísimas gracias y doy el pase a la doctora, perdón, a Juan Pablo para la presentación de la doctora Carolina. Muy amable.
Muchas gracias, Daniela, en particular por conectar la situación trágica del pueblo ucraniano y las repercusiones en nuestro contexto, ¿no? En Latinoamérica, en la región, que también, como sabemos, hay una serie de problemas de diverso índole, incluyendo crisis humanitarias. Ahora tengo el placer de presentar a la profesora Carolina Loaiza Tamayo. Ella es magistra en Derecho Penal Internacional, docente de la Universidad Tecnológica del Perú y, como muchos de ustedes saben, una muy destacada litigante, ¿no?, en el sistema interamericano de derechos humanos. Carolina, por favor, 15 minutos. Gracias. Tu micro, Carolina. Mute, está en mute. Unmute.
Okay, that's right. Gracias, Juan Pablo, por la presentación. Thanks so much for your speeches, professors. Ellos y ellas, mi presentación, por supuesto, va a ser en español. Ellos y ellas, en su exposición, nos han presentado los diferentes retos, desafíos del derecho internacional frente a la actual crisis, ¿no?, en el contexto de este orden jurídico internacional, los argumentos que sustentan la violación del derecho internacional por Rusia en Ucrania, sobre los mecanismos penales del derecho internacional y no penales que nos ofrece este orden jurídico para las víctimas individuales y colectivas de la invasión de Ucrania por Rusia, ¿no? Y esta diversidad de mecanismos que nos ofrece, ¿no?, desde el ámbito penal, como la Corte Penal Internacional, la posibilidad de la creación de un tribunal especial para el crimen de la agresión, y la jurisdicción nacional penal internacional, que es la prioritaria, en tanto toda jurisdicción penal internacional es complementaria. Y los otros mecanismos, ¿no?, a los que se ha referido Daniela también, como la Corte Internacional de Justicia. Tenemos también al Tribunal Europeo de Derechos Humanos, que ha adoptado unas medidas provisionales hace poquísimo, hace unos días. Hay una nota de prensa al respecto, porque se solicitó el 28 de febrero al Tribunal Europeo, y el 1 de marzo el Tribunal Europeo ha adoptado unas medidas provisionales. Y también, por cierto, las respuestas de los diversos órganos y organismos universales y regionales y estatales a este conflicto. Hemos podido escuchar cómo se nos ha contextualizado y se nos ha referido básicamente a la resolución 68-262 de la Asamblea General de Naciones Unidas sobre la integridad territorial de Ucrania, que fuera aprobada el 27 de marzo del 2014 en respuesta a la crisis de Crimea, donde los estados de la comunidad internacional organizada, que es Naciones Unidas, afirmaron el compromiso de Naciones Unidas para reconocer a Crimea como parte de Ucrania, rechazaron el referéndum sobre el estatuto político de Crimea, ¿no?, y han exhortado a las partes que desistan, ¿no?, que desistan y se abstengan de realizar acciones encaminadas a la ruptura parcial o total de la unidad nacional y la integridad territorial de Ucrania. Pese a todas estas invocaciones del 2014 y a los informes del Alto Comisionado de Naciones Unidas en la resolución 2630, que daban cuenta de la situación de Ucrania desde noviembre de 2013 a septiembre del 2014, esta resolución da cuenta de cómo, a pesar de eso, la crisis continuó. Y la misión de observación de los derechos humanos de Naciones Unidas, que monitoreó la misión en Ucrania, nos dio cuenta de de cómo el gobierno ucraniano lanza una operación para restablecer el control de los territorios de las regiones de Donetsk y Luhansk, ¿no? Estableciendo un puesto de control, y cómo en mayo del 2014 se autoproclaman, estamos en el 2022, en mayo del 2014 se autoproclamaron repúblicas populares, ambas regiones, Donetsk y Luhansk, tras la celebración de unos supuestos referéndums. Ni el gobierno de Ucrania ni la comunidad internacional reconocieron estas proclamaciones. Sin embargo, se vieron daños, afectaciones a los derechos humanos en ese contexto, y el impacto que generó, como fue la crisis de refugiados. O sea, desde el 2014 tenemos esta crisis que ha dado, según el alto comisionado, la oficina del alto comisionado de Derechos Humanos de Naciones Unidas, que más de 378.000 personas cruzaran la frontera de la Federación Rusa, y de otras violaciones a los derechos humanos, ¿no? Y el principal desafío, estoy hablando del 2014, era pues la intromisión de la Federación Rusa, que contravenía la resolución 58 diagonal 262 de la Asamblea General de Naciones Unidas, y que ha dado numerosos problemas legales por la regulación de la ciudadanía rusa en la región, y los residentes en Crimea, que son muy conocidos por su posición pro-ucraniana, ¿no? Entonces a eso se refirió precisamente el profesor Tatze en su presentación, ¿no? Es decir, que el entorno que existía en la comunidad internacional frente a esta situación era la promoción de los derechos humanos en Ucrania, y que esto dependía del respeto de la resolución 68-262 de la Asamblea General sobre la integridad territorial de Ucrania, ¿no? Como todos y todas sabemos, estamos leyendo las noticias todos los días sobre Ucrania. El 2 de marzo de este año se aprobó en la Asamblea General una nueva resolución, la 12407, y en su 11ª sesión de emergencia especial, ¿no? Y en esta resolución se demanda a Rusia que termine el ilegal uso de la fuerza en Ucrania con sus tropas. En el aspecto humanitario, la Asamblea General demandó a todas las partes que permitieran el paso seguro y sin trabas a destinos fuera de Ucrania, y que facilitaran también el acceso a quienes necesitaran asistencia dentro del país. Es el contexto internacional que nos han descrito nuestros expositores que me han precedido. Entonces resulta muy claro que los argumentos dados, ¿no es cierto?, que nos han presentado y que presentan los retos que señaló el profesor Sergei Masol, ¿no? Que tienen que ver con las alegadas justificaciones del uso de la fuerza, el uso legítimo de la fuerza por parte de Rusia, ¿no? Entonces, todos sabemos, o sea, y toma como base el artículo 51, todos y todas hablamos de lo mismo, el artículo 51 de la Carta de Naciones Unidas. Sin embargo, la invocación que hace el Estado de la Federación de Rusia es que es para protegerse, ¿no?, de algún tipo de amenaza que emana de Ucrania. Esto pues nos está presentando una teoría, ¿no?, de lo que se conoce como autodefensa anticipada o autodefensa preventiva, ¿no? O sea, cuando no se está frente a un ataque armado, contra Rusia, y no existe ninguna amenaza existencial tan grave que es necesario actuar para prevenirlo, ¿no? Si bien es cierto que la legítima defensa está reconocida por el derecho internacional en tanto derecho inmanente de todo Estado soberano, permite pues que el Estado rechace de forma violenta e inmediata un ataque ilegítimo contra su territorio. Pero para que ésta pueda efectuarse se requiere un conjunto de requisitos como inmediatez, es decir, que se lleva a cabo inmediatamente después de haberse producido el ataque armado y no como una represalia, ¿no? Otro requisito es la necesidad y la proporcionalidad que son impuestos por el derecho internacional consuetudinario. En consecuencia, vemos cómo existe además una obligación de comunicación inmediata al Consejo de Seguridad, ¿no? Permitiendo entonces que la legítima defensa termine cuando hay una... cuando ya el Consejo de Seguridad ha tomado conocimiento y está dispuesto, lo ha dispuesto. En consecuencia, no ha existido pues una base legal para la llamada defensa preventiva por carecer de legitimidad. Aun cuando algunos estados, inclusive la doctrina norteamericana, defiende la legalidad de la legítima defensa anticipada, la legítima defensa preventiva, o sea, hay que distinguirla, ¿no? O sea, de la legítima defensa, porque esta surge cuando un ataque armado que es inminente, pero que podría llevarse a cabo en el futuro, ¿no? O sea, como por ejemplo el caso de la guerra de Irak o el ataque iraní a un reactor nuclear iraní en 1981, y esto ha sido rechazado pues por la Organización de Naciones Unidas. Entonces, estamos, o sea, viendo cómo no se da la premisa básica para que, como argumento justificatorio del accionar de la Federación de Rusia. Un segundo argumento podría ser la legítima defensa colectiva de las repúblicas de Donetsk y Luhansk, ¿no? Supuestamente independientes, y esto nos llevaría a preguntarnos si estamos frente realmente a un Estado y si lo son o no lo son. Y desde el derecho internacional, desde toda la teoría del derecho internacional, sabemos perfectamente que la creación de los Estados, si bien es cierto, se dio principalmente en los siglos pasados, el siglo XX también se presentaron situaciones de creación de estados, ¿no? Como por ejemplo, como consecuencia de la desintegración de la Unión de Repúblicas Socialistas Soviéticas en el año 91, Yugoslavia, de Checoslovaquia, y que son procesos que generan importantes consecuencias de acuerdo al derecho internacional. Un Estado puede nacer sin que para ello sean necesarias acciones y decisiones específicas, ¿no? Sino como producto de la historia, el devenir de la historia, el desarrollo humano, de la vida política. Sin embargo, consideramos que esa no es la situación que se ha presentado en 2014, en mayo de 2014, para la autoproclamación de independencia de las repúblicas, de estas repúblicas, de las regiones de Ucrania, ¿no? Entonces, más aún, no hay reconocimiento por parte de los estados, ¿no? La posible incorporación de un nuevo estado a la comunidad internacional no depende necesariamente de su reconocimiento. Sin embargo, el silencio de los estados es manifiesto, ¿no? O sea, el silencio, la ausencia de reconocimiento nos está señalando claramente que no estamos frente a un Estado. Hay otro argumento, finalmente, es un poco para terminar, dado que los expositores que me han precedido han tocado todos los temas sumamente interesantes. Es uno que se refiere al argumento de la intervención humanitaria, ¿no? O sea, Rusia está actuando para detener o prevenir un genocidio de rusos, ¿no? La intervención humanitaria es rechazada como excepción válida a la prohibición del uso de la fuerza por la mayoría de los juristas internacionales. La pregunta sería respecto a los alcances del significado de intervención humanitario, fenómeno nuevo en las relaciones internacionales y en el derecho internacional, en el nuevo orden internacional establecido en el siglo XX, aun cuando hay antecedentes previos, ¿no? O sea, la acción coercitiva, o sea, de uno o más estados, en un tercer estado, sin el consentimiento de con el propósito de prevenir o detener graves o masivas violaciones de derechos humanos, como lo ha definido el profesor Bermejo, y que dice el profesor Tom Farrer que es para proteger a los propios nacionales, que en realidad se extiende a la protección de toda la población que se encuentre en ese territorio, que es bajo su jurisdicción, o sea, nacionales y extranjeros. La información oficial de Naciones Unidas en sus informes, en sus resoluciones, nos presenta un escenario distinto, contrario a la existencia de graves y masivas violaciones de los derechos humanos en Ucrania y en estas regiones específicamente, que justifiquen una acción extrema como lo es de la intervención de terceros estados. En el informe, o sea, del 2014 se decía que había llegado los civiles muertos a 2.084 personas. Y entonces esa cifra ha ido decreciendo, de forma tal que al 2021 se referían que solamente 15 personas civiles habían sido afectadas, ¿no? Con lo cual no existe el escenario, de graves y masivas violaciones a los derechos humanos a lo que están apuntando, ¿no? Caso contrario, el propio sistema de Naciones Unidas, a través del Consejo de Seguridad, podría haber puesto en marcha la aplicación del artículo 41 de la Carta de Naciones Unidas, que lo autoriza a adoptar medidas sin uso de la fuerza para aliviar esta situación, ¿no? En este contexto, los convenios de Ginebra autorizan la asistencia humanitaria, la protección de las víctimas del conflicto por terceros estados de manera imparcial, que no pueden ser considerados como injerencia en el conflicto armados y menos actos hostiles. Pero no existe en el derecho internacional actual un marco convencional para la llamada intervención humanitaria en el derecho internacional. Por eso es que consideramos que tampoco existe este sustento jurídico para el accionar de la Federación Rusa. Creo que uno de los aspectos más importantes y que debemos llamar la atención es la reacción de la comunidad internacional organizada, individual, o sea, organizada a través de los estados, a través de la sociedad civil, las organizaciones no gubernamentales y de personas individuales como todos y todas los que estamos estudiando, leyendo, informándonos todos y cada día de esta situación, porque una acción como esta, que la comunidad internacional permita, en realidad es una grave amenaza para cualquier situación en cualquier parte del mundo. Por eso es, refiriéndome a las palabras de Javier Pérez de Cuéllar, que fuera citado por nuestro representante peruano en Naciones Unidas, debemos señalar que los gérmenes de la guerra deben quedar eliminados, deben quedar erradicados de toda zona del planeta. El orden mundial de la posguerra fría solo puede fundarse en la paz, ¿no? O sea, con esta reflexión voy a dar por terminada mi breve intervención, agradeciendo haber tenido el placer de escuchar a los profesores Masol, al profesor Vázquez y, por supuesto, al doctor Pérez León y a Daniela Malapi, ¿no? Y agradecer la participación de nuestros colegas y estudiantes en esta actividad académica. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Carolina, por tus muy precisas reflexiones con referencias a fuentes que no solo complementan, sino enriquecen realmente la variedad de temas que se han discutido. Bueno, ahora pasamos a la rueda de preguntas. Ahora empiezo a hablar un poco en inglés nuevamente, con alguna traducción en español, si es necesario. Sergi and Yori, I guess that you are still there. There are some questions on the chat box, as you probably already read. But just in case, I will read a question out for everyone here. So basically, there is a question by, I see this Mario Chinchai, or Chincha, well, it doesn't display the full family name. But anyway, for Sergei and George, the question is, do you think that Russia is rebuilding a pan-Slavism movement? He means, do you think that Russia is not going to stop until all the countries which formerly for the USSR become satellite countries of a Russian empire? Or maybe, as we can think about George's words, is Russia trying to build an Slavic Baltic empire with Russia as the axis? Sergei, could you please comment, and then George?
Thank you, Juan Pablo. I think the short answer would be yes, but I would probably have to accentuate certain nuances. If you read the address of Vladimir Putin of the 21st of February, preceding the recognition of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic, he said, and I quote, "Historical Russia called the USSR," end of quote. So basically for Vladimir Putin, the historical Russia covers all former republics of the Soviet Union. So from this perspective, I would not call this a pan-Slavism movement, because lots of former republics of the Soviet Union are not Slavic. For example, Uzbekistan or Azerbaijan, these are not Slavic nations. But you can say historical Russia in the words of Vladimir Putin. And based on his own words, I would claim that he would continue the restoration of this big Russian empire, as you can say. So it would have nothing to do with communism as the unifying factor, as it used to be in the Cold War era, in Soviet times. It would probably not be so much about pan-Slavism movement, but restoration of what Russia, of what Vladimir Putin himself believes as the historical Russian lands. And that would include the Baltic states as well, as they used to be part of the Soviet Union for some time. Then I'm not a fortune teller, of course. I cannot predict what would happen in the coming years. But for Vladimir Putin, the collapse of the Soviet Union was the biggest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. So for him, it's also a very personal thing. I would predict still that much would depend on the reaction of the West, if you can call it generally, or NATO member states, to be more specific, to be specific, to the armed conflict between Russia and Ukraine right now. So in a way, the war between Russia and Georgia in 2008 was the testing ground. Then the hostilities in Crimea and Donbass in 2014 was the second testing ground. Now there's a third testing ground. So the ambitions expand, the use of armed forces becomes more and more massive, and the reaction of the West also changes. In 2008, the reaction of Western countries was very weak. Essentially, it led to nothing. South Ossetia and Abkhazia were just taken from Georgia with no meaningful condemnation, except for words about deep concerns and so on and so forth. Now the situation, in 2014, the situation was a bit different. There were, for example, a resolution of the General Assembly on the territorial integrity of Ukraine. There were also reactions in the Council of Europe, although it was mixed, because in several years later, the Council of Europe changed its attitude toward Russia and accepted it back in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. But still, the reaction was stronger. Now we have the strongest reaction ever by NATO member states. So we'll see whether that would lead to the Russian success or not. Because you can say in 28 Russia was successful. In 2014 it was successful from the military standpoint and political standpoint. So if Russia wins this war, then its appetite would grow naturally, and it would try to grab other lands. The problematic aspect, of course, is, however, that the Baltic states are in NATO. And historically speaking, there have never been cases where NATO member states were attacked. So it would be, of course, very interesting to see whether Russia would dare attack a NATO member state in the future. So that would be perhaps my answer to this question.
Thank you, Sergi. Before giving the floor to Georgie, a brief message in Spanish. Por favor, si desea preguntas en español, y bueno, los que hablamos español contestamos obviamente en español. Y si alguien en español, si alguien quiere escribir en español dirigido a Sergi o a Georgie, haga la pregunta y lo traducimos inmediatamente para ellos. ¿Ya? Gracias. George, now you to answer. Thank you.
Many thanks to Mr. Sergey for this extensive answer, but I have also a few points to add. You know, I would agree with Mr. Sergey that Russia is more trying to, you know, make a new Soviet Union, new model of USSR. And I will recall one fact. You know that when we had Soviet Union, under Soviet Constitution, all the countries were sovereign entities, and they, under the USSR Constitution, they had right to claim independence. But the fact is, the Russia never gave them right to claim for their independence. So Russia always opposed to these countries' claim for independence, which was their constitutional right. So yes, we had this unity of Soviet Union with independent entities, institutional independent entities, but always the Russia was as its axis. So Russia always wanted to be the leader country, to be the main country, the axis of these Soviet states. So I think that the first scenario is more realistic, and Mr. Maslow has greatly discussed the speeches of Vladimir Putin, which corroborate this argument. But apart from these speeches, I will accentuate on the actions of the Russian army, because we saw this event and we saw Russian tanks passing through with Soviet Union flags. And in my view, these Russian tanks with Soviet Union flags are very symbolic, because it's not just an individual act of concrete soldier, but it symbolizes the Russian politics towards its neighbors and its plans to restore its Soviet Union. And in fact, and of course, I would agree with Mr. Maslow that it's a big tragedy for Putin, which is a Soviet Union which was destroyed ultimately. And he tries to rebuild this huge, was to at least to rebuild it, and it openly declares it. For instance, we had many speeches of Vladimir Putin where he said that, you know, Crimea was historically Russian territory, and we want to rebuild historical truth, etc., etc. So it's vivid in speeches of Vladimir Putin, as well as, and we also know that Russian soldiers in this war are with Georgievsky Tractatus Marx, which is also very symbolic, which are also Soviet Union like, which symbolizes the Soviet Union's policy, because you know that Putin was rewarding its soldiers for invasion of Georgia with this Georgievsky Tractatus Marx. So it is Soviet symbolic, so which is also war by Russian soldiers, which is also very symbolic, and it indirectly indicates Russia's plans to restore former Soviet Unions. And their threat, another thing is the threats of Vladimir Putin that, you know, if you sanction me, I will take the whole Europe. And we have open indications from Vladimir Putin that they are ready to invade all the Europe, and they are ready for that. I'm not sure how far they will go, but at least there's speculation from Vladimir Putin about it. So yes, I would also stay on the first opinion. I think that their plan, and also, and one thing is the speeches of Vladimir Putin and the actions of their army and the symbolic they wear, etc., etc., and historical precepts of all of this. And another thing is the mindset of Russian population, because I know some persons from Russia and really they admire Soviet Union, they admire Soviet system, and they think that there was truth, there was law in Soviet system, and they have like this kind of sympathy for this whole system. So Russian population, which is very calm in this situation, also supports their government in this. Yes, it's only there's a minorities which try to oppose their policy, etc., etc. But I know that mainly the main part of Russian population, directly or indirectly, support their threats to their aspires toward Soviet Union. So I think that the first argument of Soviet Union with Russia at the axis of it is more realistic at this case. But I'm not sure how well and how far they will go in this regard. So. It's my opinion.
Okay, George, just very briefly, there is another question for you from Irina Hernandez. Did you consider the soft power affected in the south of Ukraine in the development of the citizens around years to decide one position in this armed conflict? You can please answer very briefly. Thank you.
So therefore, could you repeat the question because I didn't understand it precisely? Yeah.
Is this question in the chat? I don't see it in the chat.
I also don't see this question.
Yeah, you're right. It's actually direct message. Again, for you, Georgie, quickly, please, an answer. Did you consider that the soft power affected in the south of Ukraine in the development of the citizens over the years to decide one's position in this conflict?
Yes, of course. You know, when we look at Russian policy, not only with regard to the South Crimea, but in general, Russia, in many cases, doesn't try to directly invade countries, but to use soft power. And my mentioned facts about passportization policy, Russia's policy to create compatriot organizations in these countries and to spread Russian language in these countries, and this propaganda which works in this country because Russian speaking population listen to this propaganda all the time. And you know, it's a soft power, it's Russia's soft power, and they try to build this ground out of which they invade country. Normally, if you look at Russian politics, they don't try to invade country directly. They try to create a ground for that. And my speech simplifies the situation where in Georgia and Ukraine was the same scenario. Russia was step in step gradually creating this ground by passportization policy, by spreading Russian language, by propaganda, which is supervised and sponsored by Russian television and Russian officials. So, of course, I think that this invasion of Crimea and the south part of Ukraine was grounded and was supported by this soft power, because Russia normally uses soft power before invading concrete states.
Okay, thank you so much. Now there are at least two questions in Spanish. First, I will say the question in Spanish for Daniel and Carolina's answer, and then I will translate that into English for Sergi and Yori, because we are running a little out of time. Please try to be very, very accurate in your answers. En español, Fernanda Rivera pregunta, por favor, sus opiniones respecto a las armas biológicas, bueno, a las supuestas armas biológicas de Estados Unidos, entiendo, en Ucrania. Gracias. Daniela, por favor.
Bien, hemos visto que el escenario de uso de medios y métodos para hacer la guerra en este escenario del conflicto de Rusia y Ucrania ha evidenciado un riesgo exponencial, ¿no? No solamente sobre el supuesto uso de armas biológicas, sino también sobre el supuesto uso, y digo supuesto porque evidentemente tiene que ser probado, el uso de armas que ya están prohibidas en el derecho internacional, ¿no? Hablábamos, por ejemplo, de las bombas de racimo, ¿no? Que están prohibidas en la Convención de 2008, y que ya forma parte clara de la comunidad internacional, independientemente de los estados que son, bueno, creo que ya más de 100 estados que han firmado el tratado, ¿no? Entonces, yo creo que aquí hay un reto para el orden jurídico internacional respecto de los alcances de prohibición y aplicación de sanciones por el uso de este tipo de mecanismos, de medios de uso de determinadas armas, y obviamente esto creo que va a servir como insumo para las investigaciones que se están realizando sobre la Comisión de Crímenes de Guerra, ¿no?
Muchas gracias, Daniela. Carolina, por favor, tus comentarios. Gracias.
Con relación a este tema, déjame ver, con relación a...
Sí, tus opiniones respecto a las armas biológicas de Estados Unidos, bueno, lo que sostiene.
Con relación a este tema,
en Ucrania. Sí.
La Embajada de Ucrania en Polonia ha enviado un documento donde precisamente está haciendo referencia a esta situación. Yo creo que la Corte Internacional de Justicia, en la adopción de sus medidas provisionales, lo va a tomar en cuenta. Creo que es la Corte la que va a hacer la evaluación, la primera evaluación, el primer acercamiento a esta situación. Indudablemente, el derecho internacional humanitario, ¿no? Los convenios de Ginebra y otros instrumentos convencionales sobre la proscripción de las armas masivas son claras en ese sentido, ¿no? Pero creo que la coyuntura misma de que la Corte tenga que adoptar una medida provisional, ¿no? A solicitud de Ucrania, nos de cierta manera crea un contexto favorable en relación a este tema, ¿no? Y esperemos que pronto, ¿no? Sea pronto y no tardíamente tengamos este pronunciamiento. Pero sí existen denuncias por parte de Ucrania en el sentido de la utilización de este tipo de armas, ¿no? O sea, no hay, yo creo que es la segunda vez que en medio de un conflicto, o sea, ya está operando el sistema de justicia. El primero fue la ex Yugoslavia, ahora estamos en un nuevo contexto y creo que eso va a favorecer, porque creo que la comunidad internacional está optando por una nueva forma de alcanzar la paz, usando la justicia como un mecanismo para restituirla, ¿no? Creo que es muy importante. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Carolina. Now I translate a question by Fernanda Rivera for Sergi and Yori. Please, very, very precise answer because we are running out of time. What is your opinion concerning the claim, the Russian claim, I understand, about biological weapons developed by the United States of America in Ukraine? Sergi first, and then Yori. Thank you.
To answer this question very briefly, it is a disputable fact. So it's not clear whether this fact is true or not. So the Russian Federation claims it has happened. There was such research. Ukraine claims it has never happened. And so basically I cannot provide any other answer apart from these two polarly different factual claims. And that goes back to the problem which I outlined in my presentation about the widespread use of smartphones by ordinary people, the abundance of information which we have, and at the same time, lack of reliability of this information. What can we trust and what we cannot trust? So it basically boils down to the trustworthiness of fact-finding missions. Or, yeah.
Thank you. Georgie, please.
I think that apart from these arguments that were spread by, especially from Russian side, that they will use this type of weapon, biological weapons. Before that, they spread information that they will use nuclear weapon. And as Mr. Sergey rightly noted out, we don't know the truthfulness of such information. But at this stage, what we can say is that, in my opinion, Russia is now out of resources. These economic sanctions imposed on Russia has huge impact on Russian population and Russian government. So they are, of course, out of resources. They have a huge crisis. So Russia wants, in this case, to transmit our attention to other issues and to threaten Europe. It's a type of propaganda, in my view, that they will use this type of weapon and to have psychological effect on Ukrainian population, who are very brave, who are fighting bravely against Russian aggression and against Russian occupation. And I think that it's a part of Russian propaganda. And I think that the basis of this argument is that Russia is gradually out of resources. Russia has huge losses in this war, and I have huge suspects that Russia can do anything in this war, really, because in my opinion, Ukrainians are really winning this war, and Russia has also a huge economic crisis. So I think that the Russia claims that they will use biological weapons or nuclear weapons, which does not objectively correspond to the facts which have, and of course the fact-finding commission should find the truthfulness of this information. I think that it serves to have psychological effect on brave Ukrainian population who did not surrender to Russians this provocative action. So at this stage, I can say that it may serve the Russian propaganda and Russia threatening for Ukrainian persons to have psychological effect on this population.
Thank you. Now, a question in Spanish that I will later translate. Now, I read it in Spanish. Empezamos con Daniela y luego con Carolina. La consulta de Augusto es, ¿qué papel juega América Latina en este nuevo orden internacional? Normalmente recibimos, él comenta, los impactos negativos, pero podemos jugar un papel para que la ONU reaccione a través de sus organismos como la Corte Penal Internacional o hacer incidencia en el Tribunal Europeo. Y por aquí también señala él, Augusto, Estados Unidos tiene un juego propio en el conflicto y América Latina debe adoptar una posición como la Comunidad Andina, la OEA, entre otros. Brevemente, por favor, Daniela y luego Carolina. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Juan Pablo. Muchas gracias por la pregunta también. Bueno, América Latina va a jugar un papel, yo creo, bastante importante, ¿no? Obviamente sabemos que el impacto de las sanciones ya está siendo evidenciado en el plano económico. Todos los días vemos a través de los noticiarios el alza de precios de productos de energía, combustible, etcétera, que no solamente afecta al consumo directo del producto, sino también a todos los servicios que se prestan a través de su uso, ¿no? Pero también viendo desde el punto de vista, a ver, no quiero decir positivo, porque estamos en una crisis política de gran impacto, pero podemos evidenciar que hemos como revivido los hitos más importantes de la Guerra Fría, ¿no? Es como si se hubiera reactualizado esos espacios de conflicto y controversia de la Guerra Fría, en el que América Latina jugó un papel también importante. ¿Por qué? Porque tanto el bloque de Estados Unidos como de Rusia van a tocar nuevamente las puertas, como ya lo están haciendo en varios países de la región, y son los gobiernos de América Latina los que van a tener que tomar esa decisión sumamente importante y delicada de saber cómo negocian. Porque ante este nuevo acercamiento, América Latina puede poner ciertas condiciones, puede poner priorizaciones respecto de aspectos de cooperación, ¿no? Sea en el plano económico, político, hasta militar y de defensa. Entonces, yo creo que América Latina debería, en realidad, saber aprovechar este espacio en el mejor término, lo digo, para poder ver, porque también las consecuencias de las decisiones que tome cada gobierno se van a ver de aquí a 5 o 10 años en el plano de la comunidad internacional.
Muchas gracias. Daniela, por favor, Carolina. Gracias.
Sí, yo quiero referirme a la pregunta de Augusto, el profesor Augusto Medina, si no me equivoco, sobre el tema de la Corte Penal Internacional. En primer lugar, para que la Corte Penal Internacional pueda tener jurisdicción sobre una situación de violación de crímenes internacionales, es necesario el examen preliminar, que empiece por un examen preliminar por parte de la Fiscalía. Como se sabe, hay tres formas para dar inicio a un examen preliminar por la Fiscalía. Y es que primero que sea una información por grupos o por personas o por grupos, organizaciones intergubernamentales o no gubernamentales, y eso permite a la Fiscalía dar inicio a una investigación, o sea, a un examen preliminar en motu propio. La segunda es la remisión por parte de un Estado o del Consejo de Seguridad de Naciones Unidas. Y un tercero es que el Estado concernido haya formulado una declaración aceptando el ejercicio de la competencia de la Corte Penal Internacional. Lo que tenemos aquí es que Ucrania no es parte del Estatuto de Roma y por lo tanto no podría remitir casos de crímenes internacionales o de presuntos crímenes internacionales a la Corte Penal Internacional, pero sí ha aceptado 2 veces la jurisdicción de la Corte Penal Internacional. Uno fue en el caso de la invasión de Crimea en el año 2014, y en la segunda ocasión habría aceptado la jurisdicción sobre una base abierta, ¿no? Entonces, si Ucrania no puede remitir los presuntos delitos por sí mismo, la Corte Penal Internacional tendría jurisdicción en virtud de las investigaciones, por esta aceptación amplia general de su jurisdicción, por remisión de información por parte de organizaciones no gubernamentales, personas, organismos gubernamentales y no gubernamentales, o por remisión de estados. Así es que en el 1 de marzo del año 2022, de este año, la oficina de la Fiscalía recibió una remisión por parte de Lituania, de la República de Lituania. El 2 de marzo hubo un grupo coordinado de estados partes presentando una remisión conjunta, ¿no? O sea, Albania, la Commonwealth de Australia, Austria, Bélgica, Bulgaria, Canadá, Colombia, Costa Rica, Croacia, Chipre, República Checa, Dinamarca, Estonia, Finlandia, Francia, Georgia, República Federal Alemana, República Helénica, Hungría, Islandia, Irlanda, Italia, Letonia, Principado de Liechtenstein, Luxemburgo, los Países Bajos, Polonia, Portugal, Rumanía, República Eslovaca, República de Eslovenia, República de España, Reino de Suecia, Confederación Suiza, Gran Bretaña e Irlanda del Norte, ¿no? En el 7 de marzo, Macedonia informa a la oficina que deseaba asociarse a la remisión conjunta, pero ahora, o sea, es una respuesta masiva, pero ahora hay una expansión a otros grupos regionales. 2 estados, Japón y Macedonia del Norte, han remitido la situación de Ucrania a la oficina de la Fiscalía, con lo cual han elevado el número de estados remitentes de esta situación a 41. Esto es una información reciente, ¿no? Y el fiscal resalta la acción de Japón porque dice que representa una expansión de grupos regionales involucrados en la remisión de la situación de Ucrania, ¿no? Y es el primer país asiático en hacerlo, y le agradece el fiscal este apoyo a su trabajo, y representa, ¿no? O sea, estos primeros 41 estados están representando la voluntad de la comunidad internacional, como yo lo he señalado, en que situaciones como esta, que permiten una interpretación amplia y extensa del derecho internacional, pueda ser utilizado para quebrantar la paz y poner en riesgo a toda la humanidad. De forma tal que, doctor Medina, la Corte Penal está en pleno funcionamiento, está en plena actuación en circunstancias en que se está llevando el conflicto. Y esto es histórico, ¿no? eso es histórico, como lo hizo el Tribunal de la ex Yugoslavia cuando se estaba llevando a cabo esta situación en el territorio de la ex Yugoslavia, ¿no? Espero que haya información. Con gusto les paso los links de lo que está, de los informes, e inclusive ha creado una plataforma especial para dar a conocer toda la información sobre Ucrania y la actuación de la Corte Penal Internacional al respecto. Gracias.
Many thanks, Carolina. The question, and please, very brief answers, is the following. And it's interesting, actually, because here in Latin America, we would like to have your opinion, I mean, as a Ukrainian and a Georgian expert perspective. What role does Latin America play in the new international order? By Augusto Medina. Augusto also mentioned, normally in Latin America, we receive the negative impacts, but we can play a role so that the United Nations reacts through its organizations, such as, well, the ICC and the European Court of Human Rights. Also, August mentions that the United States, according to him, has its own game in the conflict, and Latin America must adopt a position like the Andean Community Organization, American States, among others. Very briefly, please, Sergi, and then George. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan Pablo. I don't speak Spanish, but I understood that Carolina mentioned those 40 countries that referred the situation of Ukraine to, that made state referrals regarding the situation in Ukraine. And there are 2 Latin American countries in that long list, Colombia and Costa Rica.
Yeah.
So that's interesting for me, why these exact 2 countries supported this initiative, predominantly by Western countries. So I will be curious actually to monitor and these developments. I don't have an answer to this. I'm not a big expert in Latin America, but that's something interesting that Latin American states, at least these 2, they are proactive into bringing perpetrators to justice through the ICC mechanism. And I'm curious whether other Latin American states would join in the coming days or not. I think the typical narrative in many African, Asian, or Latin American countries has been focused on the Western imperialism in these states. So in Africa, you see the European colonization of the continent. In Latin America, the infamous Monroe Doctrine of the US influences in Latin America. And what is often forgotten, or perhaps people are not aware of, that in many Eastern European countries, such as Ukraine or Georgia, there is such hegemon as well. And that is not the US or Western Europe, but it is Russia. So basically what Africans have suffered from the European colonialism, the Latin America suffered from the US influences. The same here in Eastern Europe, we suffered from Russia. So this discourse where Latin American or African countries try to distance from their conflict, that is not our business, they would claim traditionally, because let Russia and the US solve that problem. We are far away from there. So I think this is a good opportunity for Latin American countries in particular to compare the regional problems and the regional hierarchical structural relationships between regional hegemons and weak states. And in this case, Latin American countries can advance their agenda, in fact, against their regional hegemon by supporting Ukrainian agenda against Russia, the Eastern European hegemon. So I think this narrative can be rewritten or reinterpreted from non-participation, not our business, to proactive involvement against the restructuring of the international legal order, where about a handful of big powers exert a lot of influence on the rest of the world. So that's a good opportunity to say their disagreement, to express their disagreement, and perhaps contribute to their to the rewriting of the international legal order, which is very likely to happen in the near future, I believe.
Thank you. Georgie, please.
Dear Juan, it's quite specific question about Latin American states and Africa, and about their possibility of their involvement in supporting Ukraine in this case. But I think that the effect by which these countries may be more active in supporting Ukraine in this case and joining ICC initiatives is that, in my view, that we witness these days that ICC, for instance, may become very important tool for resolving this conflict. And for instance, Latin America and African countries are seeing this. For instance, we saw yesterday that investigation, the ICC prosecutor asked for arrest warrants of 3 persons who committed war crimes in the territories of Georgia. And this is important for Latin American countries included, because this ICC prosecutor uses the terms occupation in terms of Georgia and in terms of Russia, which is very important. And it shows the Latin America and African countries that ICC may be an important tool for individual responsibility of this person. And of course, this case which happened yesterday, when ICC prosecutor asked for arrest warrants of 3 persons who committed war crimes in the territory of Georgia, is important for African countries. Why? Because it's the first precedent. It's the first precedent of the ICC where ICC prosecutor asked for arrest warrants across and apart from African territory. It's the first case where ICC prosecutor asks for such arrest warrants apart from African territory. So that's why it denotes, and it again signifies ICC's emerging role in this case. So it's a global process, and I think that these are parts of global processes. The African and Latin American countries may be responsible, and they also see, dear Juan, you were speaking about other tribunals and other courts and other mechanisms, international mechanisms, and apart from ICC and ICC prosecutors' recent efforts and recent events, I will also mention the European Court of Human Rights. And these African and Latin American states are also seeing that European Court of Human Rights may decide on state responsibility. And you know that there were some cases that the European Court of Human Rights, where the European Court held that persons were responsible for human rights violations, of Russian human rights violations, which had place on the Georgian territory, and huge sanctions were imposed against Russia. So these people, Latin American and African people, are seeing these developments at the international arena. So different forums and different international courts, and of course they want international truths and the existing international order to exist. And I think that's why they may be interested in getting more, being more active in this kind of processes.
Thank you. And because we had well exceeded the amount of time allocated for this event, I will read out the last question, first in Spanish and then the translation. Jesús Córdoba pregunta, durante toda esa situación de los ataques en Ucrania, se ha escuchado sobre la promesa que hizo la OTAN en los 90 de no ampliar sus límites. ¿Esta promesa realmente ocurrió? De ser así, ¿en qué documentos se amparó y qué fundamentos se tiene desde la OTAN para ampliar sus límites? Primero empezamos de repente con Carolina esta vez y luego Daniela. Gracias. Brevemente, por favor.
Ok, muchas gracias. Yo estaba pensando con relación a esa pregunta, más allá de que circule la información en relación a promesas, ¿no? Todos los sujetos de derecho internacional, los estados y los organismos internacionales que representan a los estados, son entidades abstractas, o sea, no son seres humanos, de forma tal que no traicionan, ¿no? Los estados tienen intereses, no tienen amigos ni amigas, ¿no? No tienen. y por lo tanto en ejercicio pleno de su soberanía y en función de la satisfacción de sus propios intereses pueden cambiar de opinión, de políticas, ¿no? de políticas. En realidad cuando dice Jesús dice ampliar sus límites, ¿a qué se refiere? ¿A sus competencias, a sus funciones? ¿O se refiere a la incorporación de nuevos miembros? Eso no lo sé. Imagino que tiene que ver con la promesa de no incorporar a estados, como en este caso a Ucrania. Me imagino que debe ir por esa línea, ¿no? Yo creo que esa tal promesa no existió. Y yo creo que la promesa tiene que ver con que Ucrania dijo que no iba a incorporarse, pues ahora ya se quiere incorporar y es una decisión de un Estado soberano que debe ser respetada. Los Estados toman decisiones en función de sus intereses y no de las y no de otros, no de sentimientos porque no los tienen, ¿no? Es lo que yo diría en relación al tema.
Gracias. Daniela, por favor, brevemente.
Gracias. Y brevísimamente, yo diría que en consonancia con lo que menciona la doctora Carolina, esa promesa no se ha dado tanto así que Putin más bien le está exigiendo por escrito, ¿no? Está exigiendo que esa promesa se dé por escrito para acabar con el conflicto, ¿no? Y de otro lado, yo creo que tal intención de repente sí ocurrió en alguna mesa de negociación como una evaluación de la pertinencia de la incorporación, pero iría contra el espíritu mismo de la Carta de la OTAN, porque la OTAN establece que, la Carta Constitutiva, que está abierta, es un organismo regional, ¿no? De corte de defensa militar y cooperación, abierto a los estados de Europa. Entonces, que en su mismo tratado se mencione, cosa que no existe porque no se menciona, pero que más bien, si en la Carta se establece que está abierto a los países de Europa y en la acción la OTAN diga toda Europa menos tal o cual país, iría contra el espíritu mismo de la organización. Y obviamente contra el derecho soberano, como lo dije en participación inicial, de que cada sujeto de derecho estatal, cada estado, cuando tiene esta figura y la personalidad jurídica, decide a qué organismo libremente pertenecer, ¿no? Bueno, eso es lo que podría compartir.
Gracias, Dani. Now the question in English let's start this time with Yori first and then Sergi to finalize. By Jesus Cordova. In all these contexts of attacks against Ukraine, there have been references to this so-called promise by NATO in the 90s. The promise consisted in not expanding, no, the limits, NATO's limits. Jesus asked, did this promise really take place? If so, under which documents, under which instruments can we find the legal basis concerning the extension or not of NATO's limits? Yori first, and then we finalize with Sergi. Thank you.
Yeah, dear colleagues. So the question was about NATO's possible extension. And I think that we had treaty of final settlement with respect to Germany, but it was only with respect which specifically related to Germany and the former territory of GDR, which was a deployment of non-German NATO forces. But now we see NATO's huge and emerging efforts in peacekeeping missions. We see now NATO's efforts in Georgia, for instance, where Georgia has, for instance, individual partnership action plan with NATO. And it tries to accomplish its reforms according to its plan. Georgia has a partnership for peace program with NATO. And we have military trainings with different NATO members in this regard. And what is the aim of individual partnership action plan and partnership for peace? These are programs as well as European Atlantic Partnership Council programs, which aims ultimately to expand the limits of NATO and to give more accessibility of NATO programs to these countries that, of course, participating in these important programs from Georgia and other countries are important tool to finally join this alliance for more security. So I think that it's more a myth than reality that NATO's promise in any treaty not to expand. It only strictly related to the Germany and to the former GDR. But now we see that also NATO participates in several United Nations peacekeeping missions, which is also declaration of the fact that NATO is interested to expand. And NATO, and also we see from different NATO officials that their aim is to give these countries chance to expand. And we also know that the former Warsaw Pact countries have signed Visegrad Declaration, and their aim also was full involvement in the European system and the European security system. And I think that it will not, could not happen if NATO did not give them any chance of joining NATO. So I think that this non-possible expansion of NATO is a myth, and there was no specific treaty about it, which specifically stated that NATO would not extend. And I think that all these programs, all these peacekeeping missions, the NATO is exercising in these countries, and these countries' active joining of these countries corroborates my arguments that NATO is indeed interested to expand its limits. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Sergey, please.
Thank you, Juan Pablo. Yeah, it's one of the main questions which is debated in the context of the armed conflict, and it was explicitly mentioned by Vladimir Putin in his speech: NATO's expansion to the east as a threat to Russian national security. Of course, first again, we have to deal with fact-finding, whether any such promise happened, and if it happened, in which legal form was it? It seems that there is no legal instrument which contains a legal obligation of NATO not to expand. So at best, we can speak about a political commitment by NATO not to expand to the east. And so if that is accepted as the premise, then there is a breach of NATO's political commitment not to expand. And then I would refocus the whole discussion, because I think here the discussion is slightly misleading in the framework of relations between NATO and Russia, or the West and Russia. The subjectivity of Central and Eastern European countries is ignored. And basically, the fact that these are sovereign states and that have the right to decide their own destiny, and their international organizations to join and so on, is blatantly ignored. As a Ukrainian national, I would support my country as an independent state in all respects. So if my country wants to join something to NATO or Eurasian Economic Union or Organization of American States, whatever, that is the decision, the sovereign decision of the state. And the big powers, whether Russia or the USA or China, should not have a say in this regard. And to continue this argument and to link it to the exact topic of today's conference, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, I cannot but to refer to Putin's speech once again. And importantly, he mentioned he listed a number of reasons justifying his invasion of Ukraine. And NATO expansion was only one of them. And that leads me to a conclusion that if it were only about NATO expansion, I would readily agree that NATO's breach of its political promises irritated the big Russian bear, and that it was a big geopolitical mistake by NATO to do, to expand. However, if you listen to Putin's lengthy speech or read it on the Kremlin's website carefully, you would notice that Russia brought up historical arguments, linguistic arguments, Ukrainian national military arguments, so not the threat from NATO, but from Ukrainian military itself. So a number of arguments why Russia invaded Ukraine. So how it justified the invasion. So if it were only about NATO expansion, I would accept this argument of the political breach of a breach of political commitments. But now we see that it's just one of those. So if it were not about NATO expansion, Russia would have stuck to the other arguments, and it would have been enough for Russia to do what it has done. So that would perhaps be my answer to this question.
Thank you, Sergi. On that note, and on behalf of the Faculty of Law, Technological University of Peru, and the Argentinian Academic Online Association, we once again express our thanks to all of you for this very engaging discussion. And we express our deep gratitude to our distinguished speakers, Carolina, Daniela, Yori, and especially Sergi. Sergi, many, many thanks. We know that extremely difficult circumstances, stress that you naturally endure this time. But despite all of that, you are here and we are with you. Although we are in different parts of the world right now, but we, and I think that I can speak on behalf of all of you, we really hope that this horrible situation, this series of atrocities and abuses stop, that the rule of law is reestablished in your country, and then level of justice is delivered, no? And we hope that you, your family, your loved ones are safe and can manage actually all this horrible nightmare. Now in Spanish. En representación de la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad Tecnológica del Perú y la Asociación Online Académica de Argentina, nuevamente les agradecemos mucho por este muy rico debate, muy interesante debate y evento, por su paciencia también, porque vaya que nos hemos excedido, pero creo que vale la pena. Agradecemos a todos nuestros distinguidos panelistas, Daniela, Carolina, Yori, y especialmente Sergi. Sergi nos acompaña, está en Alemania, pero obviamente como ucraniano, en toda una situación muy complicada, con la preocupación por sus familiares. Y creo que hablo en nombre de todos y todas cuando señalo que todos estamos haciendo fuerza para que esta situación termine. Estos abusos, atrocidades espantosas terminen una vez que el Estado de Derecho se restablezca lo antes posible en Ucrania. Y bueno, le deseamos a Georgi que se mantenga bien en medio de todo, que sus familiares puedan manejar toda esa situación tan trágica, ¿no? Bueno, les deseamos lo mejor, un tranquilo fin de semana, y bueno, creo que bueno, el texto va a estar no grabado, entonces pueden verlo, ahí pueden también regístrense, ¿no? Si no se han registrado en la ficha, y bueno, hasta otra ocasión. Gracias. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Muchas gracias.
Gracias.
For solidarity.
Thank you, and glory to Ukraine. And glory to heroes.
Quiero que nos vamos.